I spent years protecting my little sister. I practically raised her after our parents died. I even signed away half of our family inheritance to save her failing marriage. Then she shoved me from a helicopter for the remaining $3 million. She watched me fall into the freezing rapids, confident I was dead. As the judge raised his gavel at her probate trial months later, ready to hand her my entire fortune, I walked through the heavy oak courtroom doors in a tailored crimson suit. "You forgot one witness," I announced to the dead silent room. The deceased. The wind over the Snoqualmie River Gorge did not just blow, it roared. It was a deafening mechanical scream of helicopter blades slicing through the freezing Washington state air. My name is Rebecca. I am 31 years old, a mid-level corporate bookkeeper who lives for quiet weekends and balanced spreadsheets. But in that terrifying moment, numbers and ledgers meant absolutely nothing. I was hanging by my bare hands from the freezing metal landing skid of a hovering private helicopter 100 feet above the churning white rapids. My safety harness had somehow come unbuckled when the pilot made a sudden, violent banking maneuver. I had slid out the open door, barely grabbing the skid. I looked up, my arm muscles screaming in agonizing pain, the icy metal biting deep into my palms. I expected to see the pilot reaching down to pull me back to safety. I expected to hear my sister screaming for help. Instead, I saw my younger sister, Chloe. She was kneeling on the floor of the cabin, perfectly balanced. The wind whipped her blonde hair wildly across her face, but I could clearly see her eyes. They were completely devoid of panic. They were dead calculating and chillingly cold. Chloe lifted her heavy steel-toed hiking boot. I opened my mouth to scream her name, to beg for my life, but the vicious wind stole my voice. She brought her boot down hard on my left hand. The sickening crunch of my own fingers fracturing was swallowed by the engine noise, but the white-hot pain shot straight up my arm, exploding in my chest. I gasped, my grip failing instantly. My left hand slipped off the skid, leaving me dangling by just my right hand over the terrifying abyss. Chloe leaned out slightly, her face hovering over mine. She looked right into my panicked eyes. Her lips moved carefully, forming words I could read perfectly, even over the deafening roar. "Thanks for the trust fund, sis." Then she raised her boot one last time and stomped directly on my right hand. Gravity took me. The metallic belly of the helicopter shrank away instantly as I plummeted into the void. The air rushed past my ears like a freight train, stealing the breath from my lungs. In those endless, terrifying seconds before I hit the water, my brain did not flash my entire life before my eyes. It only flashed the mistakes, the massive bleeding sacrifices I had made for the monster who had just kicked me to my death. Our parents had passed away in a terrible car accident when I was 19, and Chloe was just a young teenager. I stood at their dual funeral, holding her trembling hand, swearing I would always protect her. I gave up my college scholarship to stay home. I worked 2 grueling jobs, balancing diner trays and data entry, staying up until 3 in the morning to study for my certified public accountant exams, just so Chloe could have a normal life. I bought her prom dresses while I wore thrift store sweaters. I practically raised her, pouring every ounce of my love into making sure she felt safe. When she married Trent, a charismatic but failing luxury real estate developer, I thought she had found her happily ever after. Trent was all flash and no substance. He drove a leased Porsche, wore flashy suits, and always talked about his next big $1 million deal. 2 years into their marriage, his real estate company faced total catastrophic bankruptcy. He owed $3 million to ruthless private equity lenders who did not take kindly to unpaid debts. Creditors were threatening to take their home, their cars, and completely ruin them. Chloe had come to my small, modest apartment, sobbing hysterically on my worn-out sofa, begging for my help. Our parents had left us a $6 million inheritance. It was divided equally, but tied up in a strict trust that I managed as the older sister and professional accountant. Without hesitation, I marched into the bank and signed over my entire $3 million half to save them. I drained my own safety net, my future, so my sister would not lose her lavish lifestyle. The remaining $3 million was locked in a secondary trust, completely inaccessible to them unless I died. The trust was ironclad, designed by our late father's lawyer specifically to prevent a spouse from liquidating it. Trent hated that. He hated that he could not touch the principal. I had to manually approve every single transfer. The helicopter tour over the gorge was supposedly Trent's big thank you gift to me. A private, luxurious afternoon to celebrate our family staying together, to celebrate my generosity. I was an absolute fool. The impact with the river was like hitting a solid wall of freezing concrete. The breath was violently ripped from my lungs. The ice-cold water enveloped me instantly, numbing my skin and sending my body into severe shock. I sank deep into the dark, churning depths, the massive current grabbing me like a giant invisible hand. I tumbled uncontrollably over jagged rocks, my body slamming against boulders hidden beneath the violent white foam. I needed air. My lungs burned with a desperate, agonizing fire. I fought the brutal current, kicking my heavy legs and thrashing my unbroken arm, fighting the suffocating darkness pressing in on me. I broke the surface for a split second, gasping a frantic mouthful of air and freezing spray before the rapids pulled me under again. It was a brutal, merciless washing machine of ice and stone. I was tossed and battered, swallowing mouthfuls of river water. But the image of Chloe's cold eyes burned in my mind, refusing to let me simply surrender and drown. I do not know how long I fought the furious river. It felt like hours of endless torture, though it was likely only minutes. The current eventually spat me out into a shallow, slower-moving bend in the river miles downstream from the deep gorge. I dragged my battered, bruised body onto the rocky, muddy shore. I collapsed face down on the freezing mud, coughing up river water, my chest heaving with desperate gasps. Every single breath was a jagged knife of pain. My ribs felt shattered, grinding against each other. My left hand was a swollen, purplish mass of broken bones throbbing with a sickening intensity. I lay there shivering violently, staring up at the unforgiving grey Washington sky. I was alive. Against all mathematical and physical odds, the river had not killed me. But as the shock began to slowly recede, a chilling, terrifying realization washed over my freezing body. If Chloe and Trent knew I had survived that fall, I was a dead woman. They had 3 million reasons to make sure I never walked out of these dense woods. Trent was deeply in debt to dangerous, violent people. The kind of people who would gladly send a professional to finish the clumsy job his wife had started. If I went to the local police right now, it would be my word against theirs. They would simply claim it was a tragic, unavoidable accident, that my harness failed, and that Chloe had bravely tried to pull me back in. Trent would hire high-priced, ruthless defense lawyers to destroy my credibility, and I would be vulnerable and exposed. I could not be Rebecca right now. Rebecca, the loving, sacrificing sister, was dead at the bottom of the gorge. I had to become a ghost. I forced myself to stand. The pain in my ribs was blinding, causing black spots to dance in my vision, but the adrenaline and pure freezing rage kept me on my feet. I stumbled into the dense, dark woods, deliberately moving away from the river and the main tourist roads. I walked for hours. My wet clothes clung to my shivering body, chilling me to the bone. The temperature was dropping rapidly as evening approached. I needed shelter immediately. I needed medical attention that would not ask annoying questions or demand identification. My mind, trained as a meticulous auditor to remember hidden details and geographical data, recalled an old off-the-grid loggers clinic I had seen on a regional zoning map years ago. It was a cash-only under-the-table facility that treated undocumented timber workers and people who desperately wanted to stay off the official radar. I pushed blindly through the dense, scratching underbrush, my broken hand cradled tightly against my chest. The woods grew darker, the shadows stretching like long, menacing fingers. I focused entirely on placing one foot in front of the other. The image of Chloe's dead, calculating eyes kept flashing in my mind, fueling my agonizing steps. "Thanks for the trust fund, sis." Those venomous words echoed with every painful heartbeat. Just as the sun completely disappeared below the tree line, casting the forest into pitch blackness, I saw the dim, flickering light of a single bulb hanging over a wooden porch. The loggers' clinic. It was a rustic, weathered cabin tucked away behind a thick stand of towering pine trees. I dragged myself up the wooden steps, my heavy boots leaving muddy, wet tracks on the boards. I pushed the heavy wooden door open with my good shoulder. The clinic smelled strongly of rubbing alcohol, old wood, and iodine. A large, bearded man in a faded flannel shirt looked up from a clipboard behind a small, cluttered reception desk. He took one long look at my battered, bruised face, my soaking wet clothes and my mangled hand. He did not reach for a telephone. He did not ask for a health insurance card or a driver's license. He just stood up slowly and pointed to a small examination room down the narrow, dimly lit hall. I walked in and sat heavily on the crinkling paper of the exam table. A tired-looking older nurse came in shortly after. She asked me my name, holding a blank chart. I stared at the peeling paint on the wall, my mind rapidly running through the calculations of my new dangerous reality. I gave her a fake name. I told her I had taken a bad fall while doing a solo hike of the marked trails and lost my pack. She nodded slowly, her eyes telling me she did not believe a single word of it, but she did not press for the truth. She taped my fractured ribs tightly, wrapping my chest in thick bandages. She set my broken fingers with painful, brutal precision, making me bite down on my own lip to keep from screaming, and then she gave me a strong, unprescribed painkiller. I paid her with the soggy emergency cash I always kept wrapped in plastic in my bra. As I sat alone in that sterile, quiet room waiting for the heavy painkillers to kick in, my eyes scanned the small space. On a desk in the corner sat an older communal computer terminal used for basic logging and inventory. The screen was glowing faintly. I looked at my reflection in the small metal mirror above the sink. My face was bruised purple, my lip was split and crusted with dried blood, and my eyes looked haunted and hollow. But beneath the exhaustion and the agonizing physical pain, a new terrifying fire was burning. I had spent my entire adult life following the rules, sacrificing my own happiness and financial security to build a safe, comfortable world for my family. I had audited corporate ledgers, balanced books down to the penny, and foolishly believed that loyalty and love would be repaid with the same. I was horribly wrong. My sister and her husband had looked at my unconditional love and seen only a massive bank account waiting to be drained. They had pushed me into the abyss without a single second thought. They thought I was drowning at the bottom of a freezing river, conveniently erased from existence so they could claim their grand prize. Right now, they were probably calling the authorities, crying fake tears, and preparing to celebrate my death. They were getting ready to spend my money. They were going to live the lavish, carefree life they had brutally tried to murder me for. I lowered my eyes from the mirror and looked at my bandaged, throbbing hand, then over to the glowing computer screen. They had made a fatal miscalculation. They had forgotten exactly who they were dealing with. I was a senior corporate bookkeeper. I knew every password, every hidden account, every financial secret they possessed. I used to manually manage their taxes. I knew how to trace stolen money, and I knew exactly how to completely bankrupt a person legally. I was not going to hide in these woods forever. I was going to use the very accounting skills they thought were so boring to completely destroy their lives. I walked over to the computer and placed my good hand on the mouse. The naive, sacrificing sister died in the river. It was time to start auditing the surviving monsters. The air inside the clinic smelled of stale coffee, rubbing alcohol, and damp wool. It was a rugged cinder block structure, hidden deep within a thicket of towering evergreen trees far from the main highway. I dragged my battered body across the threshold, every step sending jagged shards of agony through my fractured ribs. A heavy wooden door slapped shut behind me, muting the howling wind outside. A burly man with a thick beard and a faded flannel shirt looked up from a clipboard behind a scratched laminate reception desk. He took one look at my bruised face, my torn clothes, and my mangled, swollen right hand, but he did not reach for a telephone to call the authorities. This was an off-the-grid logger clinic. They catered to undocumented timber workers and people who desperately needed to stay invisible. I was banking my life on their silence. A tired-looking nurse emerged from a back room. She wore faded blue scrubs and had kind but weary eyes. She asked for my name and what had happened. I gripped the edge of the counter, fighting a wave of dizzying nausea. My name is Amanda. I lied, my voice a raw rasp. I took a bad fall off a ridge while doing a solo hike. I lost my pack in the river. She nodded slowly. She knew I was lying. The bruises on my neck and the deliberate crushing injuries to my hand did not come from a simple hiking tumble. But true to the nature of the clinic, she asked no further questions. She led me down a narrow corridor into a small, sterile examination room. For the next hour, I endured a silent agony. She tightly wrapped my fractured ribs with thick athletic tape, cleaned the deep lacerations on my arms, and set the broken fingers of my right hand with brutal, practiced efficiency. I bit down on a rolled-up towel to keep from screaming. When she finally handed me a paper cup with 2 generic painkillers and a glass of water, I swallowed them greedily and paid her with the soggy emergency cash I kept hidden inside the lining of my waterproof jacket. She told me I could rest in the small recovery room at the end of the hall for a few hours. The room was sparsely furnished with a vinyl cot, a metal folding chair, and a battered wooden desk. Sitting on that desk was a bulky communal computer terminal. Its screensaver bounced a pixelated logo across a glowing background. I sat on the edge of the cot, waiting for the heavy painkillers to dull the sharp edges of my physical agony. But my mind was racing with terrifying clarity. I had survived the fall. I had survived the freezing river, but I was far from safe. I stood up, ignoring the throbbing pain in my chest, and walked over to the computer. The naive, over-sacrificing sister who had funded her family's lavish lifestyle was dead at the bottom of that river gorge. I needed to know exactly what the people who murdered her were doing right now. I placed my uninjured left hand on the mouse and woke up the monitor. The internet connection was sluggish, routed through an old satellite dish, but it was enough. I opened a private browsing window and quickly routed my connection through a secure proxy server. I had spent years as a senior corporate bookkeeper. I knew how to cover my digital tracks. First, I accessed my own cloud storage and banking portals. I needed to secure my remaining assets before they tried to freeze them. I changed the master passwords, implementing complex two-factor authentication protocols routed to a secure burner email address I had set up years ago for corporate audits. Once my own perimeter was secured, I went on the offensive. I typed in the URL for the banking institution that held Trent and Chloe's joint accounts. For years, I had manually managed their taxes, balanced their books, and rescued them from their own financial incompetence. I knew their security questions by heart. Trent's childhood pet, Chloe's first car, the street they grew up on. I bypassed their security measures in less than 3 minutes. The financial dashboard loaded, displaying their current balances and recent transaction history. I navigated to the ledger, my eyes scanning the rows of data with practiced precision. The numbers painted a picture of grotesque entitlement. While I had been working 60-hour weeks and eating cheap takeout to rebuild my own savings, they were bleeding cash. I saw recent charges for thousands of dollars at high-end boutiques, massive bar tabs at exclusive downtown clubs, and a staggering monthly lease payment for a brand new luxury SUV. But what caught my attention was a series of frantic, massive cash withdrawals made just 2 days before the helicopter trip. I dug deeper, accessing Trent's personal business accounts. He was a luxury real estate developer whose ambition vastly exceeded his actual talent. His company ledgers were a disaster. He had been shuffling money between shell companies, trying to cover massive shortfalls in his construction budgets. But the real horror revealed itself when I hacked into his private email server. I bypassed his weak password security and began filtering his inbox by urgent attachments and legal keywords. I found a folder hidden within a subdirectory labeled simply as estate planning. I clicked the folder open. It was packed with digital drafts of highly specific legal documents. I opened a PDF file titled Petition for Expedited Declaration of Death in Absentia. My blood ran cold as I read the legal jargon. Standard state law usually requires a waiting period of several years to declare a missing person legally dead. But Trent had hired a ruthless high-priced attorney to draft a petition to bypass that waiting period. The document specifically cited the treacherous nature of the Snoqualmie River Gorge and categorized the helicopter accident as a completely unsurvivable catastrophic event. The petition was ready to be filed with the federal probate court. He had these papers drafted weeks before we ever got on that helicopter. The entire trip was a premeditated execution. I opened another string of emails between Trent and a private lending firm. The language in the emails was not standard corporate correspondence. It was aggressive, threatening, and violent. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with sickening clarity. Trent owes $3 million to dangerous private equity sharks, and Rebecca's death is their only way out. He had borrowed money from people who broke legs and ruined lives when they were not paid back on time. They were demanding their $3 million immediately. The only way Trent could get that kind of liquid capital was to murder me, have me declared legally dead through an expedited court order, and seize the remaining $3 million in the ironclad trust fund I controlled. Chloe had not just kicked me out of a helicopter because she was greedy. She had done it to save her pathetic, fraudulent husband from the violent consequences of his own failure. I minimized the email window and opened a local Seattle news website. I needed to see what the public narrative was. Right there on the front page was a breaking news banner. Tragic helicopter accident over Snoqualmie Gorge, claims local woman. I clicked the video link. The footage showed the front lawn of the lavish mansion I had helped them save from foreclosure. Trent was standing there wearing a somber dark suit, looking like the picture of a devastated brother-in-law. But it was Chloe who stole the show. My younger sister stood before a cluster of microphones and news cameras. She was wearing a simple, elegant black dress. Her blonde hair was pulled back perfectly, framing a face devoid of makeup. She clutched a crumpled tissue in her hand. When the reporter asked her what happened, Chloe broke down into flawless, heart-wrenching sobs. She looked directly into the camera lens, her eyes wide and overflowing with fake tears. "We were just trying to have a nice family afternoon," Chloe cried, her voice trembling with manufactured grief. The wind caught the helicopter. It tilted so violently. Rebecca's harness just failed. I tried to grab her. I reached out as far as I could, but her fingers just slipped right through mine. She was my rock. She was my everything. I don't know how I am going to live without my big sister. Trent wrapped his arm around Chloe, pulling her into a protective embrace, shielding her face from the cameras as she buried her head in his chest. The reporter somberly concluded the segment, detailing the massive search and rescue operation, currently scanning the freezing rapids below the gorge, noting that survival was highly improbable. I sat in the quiet clinic room staring at the frozen frame of my sister crying on the monitor. A strange, eerie calm washed over me. I did not feel the urge to cry. I did not feel the urge to scream or throw the computer against the wall. The burning betrayal that had been suffocating me slowly hardened into a block of absolute freezing ice. I had spent my entire adult life protecting her. I had shielded her from the harsh realities of the world. I had signed away half of my inheritance to save her marriage. And in return, she had stomped on my fractured fingers, watched me fall to my death, and then gone on television to play the role of the grieving, traumatized victim so she could steal the rest of my money. I closed the news window. I had seen enough. They thought they had committed the perfect crime. They thought the river had swallowed their problem forever. They thought the boring, predictable bookkeeper was nothing more than an ATM they could permanently disable. They severely underestimated the very skills they had mocked me for. An auditor does not just count money. An auditor finds the discrepancies. An auditor exposes the lies. And an auditor always brings the balance sheet back to zero. I opened a new terminal window and began establishing a secure, untraceable connection to a dark web cryptocurrency exchange. If I was going to fight a war against a man backed by ruthless private equity predators and a sister entirely devoid of a conscience, I needed untraceable operating capital. I could not touch my own banking assets without alerting them that I was still alive. But Trent had a secret. Years ago, during a drunken Thanksgiving dinner, he had bragged about a hidden digital wallet where he kept a stash of unregulated cryptocurrency. He thought he was untouchable. He forgot that he had asked me to help him set up his encrypted hard drives when his company upgraded its servers. My good left hand flew across the keyboard. I ran a brute force decryption program using the personal data I had just scraped from his cloud files to build a customized dictionary attack against his seed phrase. It took 30 minutes of agonizing suspense, watching the progress bar crawl across the screen while my broken ribs throbbed in time with my racing heart. Finally, the screen flashed green. Access granted. I stared at the digital balance. He had nearly $80,000 tucked away in untraceable funds. I did not take all of it. Taking all of it would raise immediate alarms with his criminal creditors. Instead, I carefully siphoned exactly $50,000, routing the funds through a dozen different anonymous tumblers, before depositing them into a secure, newly minted digital wallet only I controlled. I left enough digital breadcrumbs to make the breach look like a random sophisticated hack originating from an overseas server. Trent would wake up to find his secret stash depleted, and he would blame the very criminals he was already terrified of. The psychological warfare had officially begun. I logged out of the terminal, wiping the browsing history and running a quick script to scrub the cache. I stood up from the desk. The pain in my chest was still a jagged reality, but it no longer felt like a weakness. It felt like a constant, sharp reminder of my purpose. I walked over to the small sink in the corner of the room and splashed cold water on my bruised face. I looked at my reflection in the tarnished mirror above the basin. The woman looking back at me was battered, bruised, and officially declared missing and presumed dead. I dried my face with a rough paper towel. I could not stay in this clinic much longer. Trent would eventually realize that his expedited death declaration would face scrutiny if a body suddenly washed up downstream. He would send people to canvass the local off-the-grid medical stations. I needed to move. I needed to get to a major city where I could blend in, hire legal representation that operated strictly in the shadows, and prepare the trap. I walked back out into the narrow hallway. The clinic was quiet. I found the tired nurse sitting at the reception desk, filling out paperwork. I approached her quietly. "I need to leave," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. She looked up, her eyes scanning my battered form. "You should rest. Your body has been through severe trauma." "I appreciate your help," I replied, pulling a few more crisp bills from my jacket pocket and placing them on the counter. "But I have a long way to go, and the people I am dealing with do not take days off." She looked at the money, then up at me. She understood the unspoken code of the shadows. She took the bills and nodded. "There is a supply truck heading to Seattle in 20 minutes. The driver owes us a favor. He will let you ride in the back. No questions asked." I thanked her and walked out the heavy wooden door into the cold Washington air. The wind whipped through the tall pines, carrying the scent of damp earth and coming rain. I pulled my jacket tight around my aching ribs and walked toward the idling delivery truck parked behind the clinic. The terrified, betrayed sister was gone. I was a ghost now, and ghosts do not forgive. They haunt, and I was going to haunt Chloe and Trent until they had absolutely nothing left to lose. I sat in the dim, flickering light of the logger's clinic, staring at the glowing computer screen. My broken ribs throbbed with every shallow breath, sending hot spikes of agony through my chest. The physical pain was a constant, sharp reminder of the freezing river I had just miraculously survived, but my mind was operating with a cold, terrifying clarity. I was officially a ghost. To the rest of the world, I was a woman presumed dead, her body lost at the bottom of the treacherous Snoqualmie River Gorge. But ghosts still needed operating capital to wage a war. I could not touch my own bank accounts. The moment my social security number hit the banking grid, Trent would be automatically notified through the financial tracking software I had naively installed for him. The dangerous people he owed $3 million to would gladly send a professional to finish the clumsy job my sister had started. I needed untraceable cash immediately, and I knew exactly where to find it. 2 years ago, at a lavish Thanksgiving dinner paid for entirely with my bonuses, Trent had consumed 3 glasses of expensive imported scotch and started bragging to his equally pretentious real estate buddies. He boasted loudly about a secret, unregulated cryptocurrency wallet he used to hide overseas funds from the IRS. He thought he was a financial genius completely untouched by the laws that governed ordinary working people. He completely forgot that the quiet, boring bookkeeper sitting silently at the end of the table had an eidetic memory for numbers and digital infrastructure. When his real estate company's service crashed last spring, he had begged me to come in and restore his corrupted ledgers. In doing so, I had seen the digital breadcrumbs leading straight to that hidden offline wallet. My fractured fingers ached terribly as I awkwardly typed on the clinic's communal keyboard, but I ignored the intense pain. I routed my internet connection through multiple secure proxy servers, building an impenetrable digital wall between this remote Washington cabin and the outside world. I accessed his secure server, bypassing the weak, outdated firewall he had paid a discount IT firm to build. Trent was arrogant, but he was horribly predictable. He always used variations of his leased sports car model combined with Chloe's birth year for his master passwords. I launched a customized dictionary attack against the seed phrase of his crypto wallet, using the coding skills I had picked up auditing tech startups. For 20 agonizing minutes, I watched the progress bar crawl across the screen, listening to the wind howling through the massive pine trees outside. Then the screen flashed a brilliant green. Access granted. My eyes scanned the digital balance. He had over $120,000 sitting quietly in that wallet. This was cash he had hidden away while simultaneously crying to me that he could not afford to keep the lights on in his house, begging me to dip into my inheritance to save them. I felt a surge of raw, righteous anger burn in the back of my throat, but I forced myself to remain disciplined. An auditor does not act on pure impulse. If I drained the entire account, he would immediately suspect a targeted attack panic and perhaps go into hiding. I needed to bleed him slowly to let the paranoia seep deep into his bones. I initiated a secure transfer of exactly $50,000. I routed the funds through a dozen anonymous digital tumblers, washing the money clean across international borders before depositing it into a secure, newly created digital wallet only I controlled. To completely cover my tracks, I left a trail of encrypted breadcrumbs pointing directly to a Russian server IP address. Trent would wake up, find half his secret stash missing, and assume he was the victim of a random, sophisticated overseas hack. He would have absolutely no idea the attack came from the dead woman he had just thrown out of a moving helicopter. With my initial war chest secured, I dug much deeper into his private network. I had the master keys to his digital kingdom, and I was not going to leave until I had uncovered every single rotting skeleton in his closet. I navigated through his complex business directories, completely ignoring the falsified construction invoices and inflated contractor bids I already knew existed. I was looking for the files he kept hidden, even from his own shady accountants. Deep within a nested system directory, intentionally mislabeled as archived tax forms, I found a folder vaguely titled Estate Planning. The title alone sent a profound chill down my spine. I double-clicked the folder. It contained several subfolders filled with legal drafts and aggressive financial projections, but one particular media file caught my eye. It was an audio recording extracted from the helicopter's internal dashcam system. Trent had downloaded it to his private server and attempted to delete the original file to cover his tracks. He thought dragging a digital file to the trash bin meant it was erased from existence forever. He did not realize that a senior auditor could easily reconstruct overwritten data clusters with basic recovery software. I ran the recovery script. My heart hammered against my bruised chest as I plugged a pair of cheap plastic headphones I found on the reception desk into the audio jack. I pressed play and closed my eyes, bracing myself for the brutal truth. The recording began with the deafening mechanical roar of the helicopter blades slicing through the freezing air. Then I heard Trent's voice. It was not the smooth, charismatic tone he used to charm wealthy investors. It was low, calculating, and dripping with absolute malice. He was speaking directly to the pilot over the noise-canceling headset intercom system. "I am paying you $20,000 in cash right now to fly dangerously low over the gorge," Trent said, his voice cutting sharply through the radio static. "When I give the signal, you bank hard to the right. I have already filed down the locking mechanism on her safety harness. When the cabin tilts, she's going to slide right out the open door. You do not look back, and you do not call it into air traffic control until we are miles away. Understand?" I stopped breathing. The cold air in the clinic seemed to turn into solid ice inside my lungs. He had filed down the locking mechanism. The sudden, violent banking maneuver that had sent me dangling helplessly over the abyss was not a terrifying weather anomaly. It was a purchased execution. He had planned every single detail of my murder with the cold, emotionless precision of a corporate merger. He had calculated the height, the river current, the exact angle required to guarantee I would not survive the massive fall. I squeezed my eyes tighter, picturing the moments right before the flight. Trent had hugged me tightly, told me how much he appreciated my endless financial sacrifices, and strapped me into that seat himself. He had smiled at me warmly, while locking an intentionally sabotaged harness across my chest. I forced myself to keep listening, gripping the edge of the desk. I needed to hear the rest. The audio crackled again, and then I heard my younger sister's voice. Chloe, the girl I had raised, protected, and starved myself for, sounded completely unbothered by the fact that she was about to actively participate in my brutal murder. "Are you sure the trust fund transfers automatically if she's declared legally dead?" Chloe asked, her voice completely devoid of any human empathy or hesitation. I do not want to go through a long, annoying probate battle with lawyers. My credit cards are practically maxed out, and the country club is threatening to cancel our membership. It transfers immediately, Trent replied confidently over the engine noise. The declaration of death in absentia petition is already drafted by the lawyers. As soon as she hits the water, we file the paperwork claiming extreme emotional hardship. We will be $3 million richer by the end of the month, babe. The recording ended with the sharp sound of the pilot confirming the coordinates over the roaring rapids. I pulled the headphones from my ears, tossing them onto the wooden desk. My hands were shaking so violently, I had to press them flat against my thighs to steady myself. The physical pain of my broken hand and fractured ribs paled in comparison to the psychological devastation of hearing my own sister casually discuss my violent death as a convenient way to pay off her luxury shopping debts. But the absolute betrayal did not stop there. The estate planning folder also contained a synced backup of their recent text message history. I opened the massive text log, scrolling through weeks of their private digital conversations. I had spent the last 3 years living in a cramped studio apartment, wearing cheap clearance rack clothes and working exhausting double shifts to ensure they never lost their sprawling, customized mansion. I thought I was being a devoted older sister. I thought my sacrifices were the noble foundation of our family's survival after our parents passed away. Their text messages painted a completely different grotesque picture. I am so sick of dealing with her, Chloe had texted Trent just 2 days before the helicopter trip. She came over yesterday and lectured me about budgeting for groceries. She is so boring and embarrassingly cheap. I cannot stand looking at her scuffed thrift store shoes while she sits on our custom Italian leather sofa, acting like she owns the place. Trent had replied immediately with a laughing emoji. Just play nice for a few more days, babe. We need her to authorize the final trust transfer to cover the new boat lease. Once the gorge trip is done, we never have to listen to her whine about balanced checkbooks ever again. She's not even a real sister anymore. Chloe typed back, her venomous words burning permanently into my retinas. She is just the ATM. And honestly, this ATM is broken. Time to make a permanent withdrawal. The ATM. I stared at those 3 letters until my vision blurred into a sea of pixelated light. All my life I had defined my personal worth by my ability to provide for Chloe. When our parents died in that terrible accident, I stood at their graves and promised I would keep her safe. I gave up my college scholarship dreams, my youth, my own chances at romantic happiness to make sure she never went without a single comfort. And to her, I was nothing more than a soulless cash dispensing machine. A mechanical appliance she was fully willing to destroy the exact moment it became inconvenient to listen to. I did not cry. The tears I had shed swallowing water in the freezing river were the last drops of sorrow I would ever waste on Chloe and Trent. The agonizing heartbreak I felt just an hour ago completely evaporated, leaving behind a vast empty void that quickly filled with a dark, suffocating rage. When a woman realizes her unconditional love has been brutally weaponized against her, she does not break down and surrender. She evolves into something much more dangerous. I saved the audio files, the text logs, and the financial records onto a small encrypted flash drive I found in my waterproof hiking jacket. I safely ejected the drive and gripped it tightly in my uninjured left hand. This small piece of plastic held the absolute power to completely obliterate their lives. They wanted my $3 million trust fund. They wanted to erase the boring, cheap bookkeeper from their glamorous high society world. I stood up from the computer terminal, completely ignoring the sharp stabbing pain in my ribs. I looked at the dark glass of the clinic window reflecting my bruised, swollen and battered face. The naive sister they knew was gone. They had murdered her in the cold sky above the Snoqualmie River. The woman staring back at me was an elite auditor who had just uncovered the ultimate fraud. I walked back to the small recovery cot and gathered my damp clothes. I had my untraceable operating capital safely hidden in the blockchain. I had the irrefutable dashcam audio proof of their premeditated murder plot. I had the text messages documenting their wire fraud and conspiracy. I had everything I needed to build a flawless trap they could never escape. They thought they had gotten away with the perfect crime because they severely underestimated my intelligence. They forgot that I spent my entire professional career tracking down hidden liabilities, exposing financial lies, and bringing corrupt ledgers brutally back to zero. I stepped out of the clinic room into the narrow, dimly lit hallway. The tired nurse who had set my broken hand was nowhere to be seen. The heavy wooden door leading to the outside world stood slightly ajar, letting in the biting Washington night air. I walked out into the darkness, pulling my jacket tight around my aching chest. I needed to get to Seattle immediately. I needed to find a ruthless lawyer who operated in the gray areas of the probate system, someone who hated white-collar criminals as much as I now did. Trent and Chloe were currently sleeping soundly in their lavish mansion, completely unaware that the ATM they thought they had permanently dismantled was about to bankrupt their entire existence. I stepped into the deep shadows of the towering pine trees, letting the freezing wind harden my new resolve. The paper trail of poison had been fully exposed, and I was going to force them to swallow every single drop. The sharp, biting chill of the Washington morning greeted me the second I pushed open the heavy wooden door of the clinic. The damp forest air filled my burning lungs, a harsh reminder that I was still miraculously alive. Inside that small, sterile back room, I had just finished downloading the digital evidence of my own premeditated murder onto a tiny encrypted flash drive. I zipped my damp, muddy jacket up to my chin and walked back to the reception desk. The kind, weary nurse who had set my broken fingers was quietly organizing a stack of paper charts, the soft rustle of paper, the only sound in the quiet space. I reached into the hidden lining of my waterproof hiking jacket and pulled out a thick wad of emergency cash. I placed 10 crisp $100 bills on the scratched laminate counter, sliding them toward her. She looked at the money, then up at my battered, bruised face, her eyes filled with unspoken questions. I told her I needed a ride into the city, specifically to Seattle, and I needed it without a single question asked or a name recorded in any official logbook. She nodded slowly, understanding the silent, desperate language of survival. 10 minutes later, I was sitting in the passenger seat of an old rusted pickup truck driven by a silent local logger, leaving the dense, terrifying woods behind me. I watched the towering evergreen trees blur past the passenger window, feeling the steady rumbling vibration of the engine beneath my boots. I was no longer the naive, over-accommodating sister who bled herself dry to fund a luxury lifestyle for people who despised her. That pathetic woman had drowned in the freezing, churning rapids of the Snoqualmie River Gorge. The woman staring back at me in the cracked side mirror had cold, calculating eyes. I had $50,000 of untraceable cryptocurrency safely secured in a blind digital wallet. I had irrefutable audio proof of my brother-in-law bribing a pilot to tamper with my safety harness. And I had text messages proving my own sister viewed my violent death as a convenient way to pay off her massive credit card debts. But having evidence was not enough. I needed a ruthless weapon. I needed a legal executioner. The drive took nearly 2 grueling hours, eventually dropping me on the rain-slicked outskirts of downtown Seattle. The city was a chaotic symphony of honking taxis, hurried pedestrians, and towering glass skyscrapers that reflected the gloomy, overcast sky. I blended perfectly into the sea of black umbrellas and dark raincoats, a walking ghost, moving with absolute freezing purpose. I did not go to a hospital emergency room. I did not go to a local police station. Instead, I walked several blocks to a small, unassuming brick building nestled between a busy coffee shop and an old, dusty bookstore. The tarnished brass plaque beside the heavy oak door read simply, Sterling and Associates, Probate and Estate Law. I had crossed paths with Mr. Sterling years ago during a brutal, highly publicized corporate audit. He was a semi-retired, merciless attorney who operated almost entirely in the gray, complicated shadows of the legal system. He despised white-collar fraudsters with a burning, personal passion, having lost his own substantial pension to a massive corporate embezzlement scheme decades prior. I knew instantly he was the exact kind of monster I needed to fight the monsters in my own family. I pushed the heavy door open, gritting my teeth to ignore the sharp, stabbing pain in my fractured ribs. The office smelled of old parchment, stale cigar smoke, and expensive aged leather. Mr. Sterling sat behind a massive mahogany desk. his silver hair neatly combed, his sharp, piercing blue eyes assessing me the second I walked in. He took one long look at my bruised, swollen face, my tightly bandaged hand, and my soaking wet clothes, but he did not ask if I needed an ambulance. He simply steepled his fingers, leaned back in his heavy leather chair, and waited for me to speak. I sat down across from him, placed the small encrypted flash drive on the polished wood desk, and laid out the entire horrific story from the terrifying helicopter ride to the stolen funds. Sterling listened to the audio recordings in complete, deathly silence. He read the printed transcripts of the venomous text messages between Chloe and Trent, his strong jaw tightening with every single line. When he finally looked up, his eyes held a terrifying, predatory gleam that made me shiver. "You have them dead to rights," he said, his voice a low, rumbling growl that echoed in the quiet room. "But if you walk into a police precinct right now and hand this over to a tired detective, you will lose your ultimate advantage." I frowned, the dull, relentless ache in my head throbbing against my temples. "Why?" I asked, confused. "I have the audio. I have the concrete proof of a murder plot." Sterling shook his head, leaning forward across the massive desk. "Because Trent owes $3 million to very dangerous, violent private equity sharks. If he gets arrested for attempted murder today, those loan sharks will absolutely panic. They will scramble to seize whatever assets they can, and Trent will immediately hire the most expensive, ruthless defense attorneys in the state, using whatever credit he has left. They will drag this criminal case out for years. They will claim the audio was taken out of context, that the pilot was lying to save his own skin, that it was just a tragic, chaotic accident, and you are simply a traumatized, confused survivor suffering from severe hallucinations. You will be dragged through the mud in the press, and they might even walk away with a minor plea deal." The very thought of Chloe and Trent getting a simple slap on the wrist made my blood boil with intense fury. "Then how do we completely destroy them?" I asked, leaning in closer. Sterling smiled, a cold, calculating expression that promised absolute ruin. "We do not stop them right now," he explained, tapping a silver pen against his desk. "We let them keep digging their own graves until the dirt walls collapse in on them. Trent has already drafted a petition for an expedited declaration of death in absentia. He plans to file it in federal probate court to bypass the standard waiting period so he can steal your $3 million trust fund immediately. We are going to let them file it." I stared at him, letting the immense gravity of the legal strategy wash over me. "You want me to let my own sister stand in a federal courtroom and swear under a binding oath that I am dead?" "Exactly," Sterling replied, his eyes locked onto mine. "Attempted murder is a state charge, often murky, often pled down by coward prosecutors. But perjury in a federal probate court combined with interstate wire fraud and a deliberate conspiracy to defraud a massive financial institution, those are severe federal felonies with mandatory minimum sentences. If Chloe takes the stand and lies to a federal judge to steal $3 million, she triggers a devastating cascade of financial crimes that absolutely no defense attorney can wave away with a clever argument. We let them commit the ultimate, undeniable fraud on the public record. We let them think they have completely and totally won. And when the judge is about to strike the gavel and hand them your money, we spring the trap. They will be handcuffed right there in the courtroom, their assets immediately seized by the federal government, and Trent's violent creditors will be left holding a completely empty bag. It was a brilliant plan. It was absolutely terrifyingly ruthless. It required me to stay completely hidden to endure the psychological torture of watching my family pretend to mourn my tragic death. But the final payoff would be absolute, undeniable devastation. I nodded my head slowly, feeling a dark, highly satisfying resolve settle deep into my tired bones. "Do it," I said softly. "Prepare the trap." While Sterling immediately began drafting the necessary legal countermeasures and securing a highly discreet private investigator to track Trent's daily movements, I needed to initiate the second crucial phase of my plan: psychological warfare. I needed Trent to feel the solid ground crumbling beneath his expensive leather shoes long before he ever stepped foot into a federal courtroom. I needed his paranoia to entirely consume him, to make him reckless, terrified, and highly prone to making fatal, sloppy mistakes. Sitting in a cheap cash-only motel room later that evening, I opened my newly purchased burner laptop. The $50,000 I had successfully drained from his secret unregulated cryptocurrency wallet was sitting safely in my own encrypted offshore accounts. But merely taking the money was only the very first step. I needed him to know it was completely gone. I logged into an anonymous tracking server I had established and continuously monitored his home network activity. It was nearly midnight, the rain lashing against my motel window when the alert finally flashed bright red on my screen. Trent had just logged into his hidden digital wallet. I sat in the complete darkness of the small room, illuminated only by the harsh blue glow of the computer monitor, imagining the exact look of absolute sickening terror spreading across his arrogant, handsome face. He was currently drowning in massive debt to very violent men, and he had just discovered that his final emergency safety net, his only way out, had been completely wiped out. I watched the data packets fly as he frantically refreshed the web page, his IP address pinging the server over and over again in a desperate, panicked, hopeless loop. He would instantly assume he had been targeted by a sophisticated Russian syndicate, or perhaps even by the very loan sharks he was desperately trying to evade. The seeds of absolute suffocating terror were successfully planted deep in his mind. But a silent digital hack was far too impersonal for my tastes. I needed to bring the terror directly to his front door. I needed him to understand, without a shadow of a doubt, that the ghost of the woman he brutally murdered was breathing right down his neck. Before I left the logger's clinic, I had carefully retrieved the only personal item that had survived my terrifying fall into the gorge, mostly intact. It was a heavy silver Rolex watch. Trent had bought it for me 3 years ago, using a massive financial bonus from my own corporate paycheck that he had somehow talked me into handing over to him. He claimed it was a smart investment piece, but I knew the truth. He just liked the shiny prestige of his wife wearing a luxury brand to his firm's pretentious holiday parties. The expensive crystal face was completely shattered from slamming violently against the brutal river rocks. The silver band was deeply gouged and heavily scratched, and the delicate hands were permanently frozen at the exact time I had hit the freezing water. It was the perfect, terrifying messenger. The next night, under the heavy cover of a torrential Seattle downpour, I rented an untraceable dark sedan and drove out to the lavish gated suburban neighborhood where Chloe and Trent lived. It was the very same sprawling house I had foolishly sacrificed my own financial future to save from bank foreclosure. The bitter irony tasted like dry ash in my mouth. I parked the car 3 blocks away in the shadows, pulling the heavy hood of my dark raincoat deep over my bruised face. The relentless driving rain completely masked the sound of my footsteps as I navigated the winding, perfectly manicured sidewalks. My fractured ribs screamed in blinding agony with every single step, and my broken, tightly bandaged hand throbbed relentlessly against my chest. But the burning, white-hot need for vengeance pushed me relentlessly forward. I slipped silently through the deep shadows of the tall imported oak trees lining their massive driveway. There it was. Trent's leased, custom black Porsche parked proudly on the pristine wet concrete. The massive house was completely dark, the occupants likely sleeping soundly in their expensive sheets, dreaming of the millions they were about to inherit from my tragic, untimely demise. I stepped out from the safe shadows, the freezing rain soaking straight through my clothes. I approached the sleek, expensive vehicle, my heart pounding a steady, deafening drumbeat of pure, unadulterated adrenaline. I reached deep into my pocket with my good left hand and pulled out the shattered, battered silver Rolex watch. I carefully lifted the windshield wiper on the driver's side of the Porsche and slid the heavy watch firmly beneath the thick rubber blade. It rested perfectly against the wet glass, the shattered spider-webbed face pointing directly toward the driver's seat. Trent would not be able to miss it when he walked out the front door in the morning, but I was not going to leave it to chance. I pulled out my anonymous burner phone and snapped a high-definition photograph of the smashed watch resting against the sleek, rain-slicked glass of his prized luxury car. I sent the single terrifying image directly to his private personal number using an untraceable texting service. He would receive the message immediately. He would recognize the deep, violent scratches, the broken crystal, and the frozen, horrifying time of death. He would know instantly that this specific watch had been to the absolute bottom of the gorge, and he would realize with a cold, suffocating, paralyzing dread that the woman he had pushed out of a moving helicopter was not resting peacefully at the bottom of the river. The psychological warfare had officially, beautifully begun. I turned my back on the lavish stolen house disappearing quietly into the pouring rain, perfectly ready to watch their entire fraudulent world burn straight to the ground. The neon sign of the cheap roadside motel flickered a sickly buzzing red through the thin stained curtains of my room. It was a miserable claustrophobic little box, smelling heavily of stale bleached damp carpeting and old regrets. But to me, sitting there with my broken ribs tightly bound and my fractured right hand throbbing with every heartbeat, it was a perfect, flawless command center. I sat cross-legged on the lumpy, sagging mattress, with my newly acquired burner laptop glowing brightly in the absolute darkness. The digital trap I had meticulously laid in the freezing Seattle rain the night before was finally about to snap shut. I had my cheap plastic headphones pressed tightly against my ears, monitoring the synced audio feed from Trent's compromised smartphone. I also had a live high-definition video stream running perfectly from the expensive smart home security cameras I had personally paid for and installed for them last Christmas. They thought those cameras were just an expensive toy to keep suburban criminals out of their pristine lives. They never once imagined those very cameras would invite a vengeful ghost back into their home. It was exactly 6 in the morning when the heavy custom mahogany front door of the lavish suburban mansion swung open. Trent walked out confidently onto the pristine, swept concrete driveway. He was dressed flawlessly in his custom-tailored Italian suit, holding a steaming cup of artisan coffee, ready to conquer his fraudulent real estate world with his usual unearned arrogance. Through the crystal-clear camera feed, I watched his confident strut completely falter the exact second he reached his leased black Porsche. He froze instantly, as if hitting an invisible brick wall. The porcelain coffee cup slipped from his perfectly manicured hand, shattering loudly on the concrete driveway and splashing hot brown liquid all over his expensive polished leather shoes. He was staring directly at the sports car's windshield. Right there, pinned deliberately beneath the heavy rubber wiper blade, was the shattered, scratched silver Rolex watch. The exact watch I was wearing when his wife violently kicked me out of the hovering helicopter. Trent staggered backward, as if the sleek, expensive vehicle had suddenly caught fire. He looked wildly up and down the quiet, manicured suburban street, raw panic seizing his entire body and making his shoulders shake. He snatched the damaged watch from the glass, his chest heaving with rapid, terrified breaths. The psychological poison I had planted was taking effect beautifully. In his deeply guilty mind, there were only 2 impossible explanations for this nightmare. Either the boring, naive sister-in-law he had brutally orchestrated the murder of had somehow miraculously crawled out of a freezing river gorge to haunt him, or the shady mercenary pilot he had bribed was engaging in a ruthless game of extortion. Given his massive, crushing debts to incredibly violent private equity sharks, his deeply paranoid brain instantly chose the latter. He could not accept that I was smart enough to survive, let alone strike back. I watched him practically dive into the driver's seat of the Porsche and slam the heavy door shut. A second later, my synced audio feed crackled loudly to life as his trembling fingers dialed a number. The phone rang 3 agonizing times before a gruff, tired voice answered. It was the helicopter pilot. "What the hell are you playing at?" "Trent," screamed his voice, echoing harshly in the confined leather interior of the sports car. "Do you think I am some kind of idiot? Do you think you can shake me down for more cash after the job is done?" The pilot sounded groggy and immediately defensive. "What are you talking about, Thompson? I am eating my breakfast in my kitchen. I have not spoken to you since the drop over the gorge." "Do not lie to me, you greedy piece of trash," Trent roared, slamming his open hand against the steering wheel so hard the horn briefly honked. "You took the watch. You went down to the river after the flight and you found her watch, and now you leave it on my car to blackmail me. I am not giving you another single dime. You already got $20,000 in untraceable cash." The pilot's voice hardened instantly, dropping any lingering pretense of polite illegal business. "Listen to me very carefully, you arrogant empty suit. I flew the exact dangerous route you paid me to fly. I banked the chopper sharply exactly when you told your psycho wife to unbuckle the safety harness. I did my part flawlessly, and I have not been anywhere near your fancy house. But since you are throwing wild threats around this early in the morning, let us talk about the remaining $30,000 you promised me to keep my mouth permanently shut about the flight logs. I do not owe you anything, Trent yelled, spittle flying onto the dashboard camera I had hacked. You broke onto my private property. You are trying to squeeze me dry because you know I am about to inherit $3 million. If you ever come near my house or my wife again, I will call the police and tell them you went rogue and deliberately threw my sister-in-law out of the sky to rob her. Are you threatening me? The pilot growled back, a dark, extremely menacing undertone, completely replacing his initial morning confusion. You are the one who paid for a premeditated murder. You are the one who owes incredibly violent loan sharks a massive absolute fortune. You think you can pin this mess on me. If I do not get the rest of my money in a duffel bag by tomorrow night, I am going straight to the Federal Aviation Administration, and I am handing them the maintenance logs showing exactly how you instructed me to tamper with the safety clips before takeoff. I will burn your entire fake life to the ground and watch you rot in federal prison. The phone line went dead with a sharp click. Trent sat in the silent luxury car, his face completely drained of all color, looking like a man standing on the gallows. He was breathing heavily, staring blankly at the shattered Rolex in his trembling hands. He had just severely alienated his only criminal co-conspirator. By blindly accusing the pilot, he had turned a greedy, neutral mercenary into an active, dangerous enemy. The fragile alliance of murderers was officially broken into pieces. I switched my attention back to the interior smart cameras. Trent burst through the heavy front door of the mansion, moving like a terrified madman. He marched straight down the hallway and into the massive designer kitchen, where Chloe was casually sipping a green detox smoothie and scrolling aimlessly through a high-end fashion website on her digital tablet. She was wearing a plush white cashmere robe, looking absolutely radiant and completely carefree for a woman who had recently stomped her older sister's broken fingers into fractured pulp. Trent threw the smashed silver Rolex onto the pristine granite kitchen island. The heavy, scratched metal clattered loudly, making Chloe jump in genuine surprise. "Look at it!" Trent shouted, his voice cracking with rising hysteria. "Look at what I just found, sitting right on the windshield of my car." Chloe's eyes dropped slowly to the broken silver band and the shattered spider-webbed crystal face. The healthy pink color instantly vanished from her cheeks, leaving her looking deathly pale and suddenly very sick. Her hand began to shake so violently she had to put her tall smoothie glass down on a coaster before she completely dropped it. How is that here?" she stammered, her confident, arrogant facade crumbling into dust in a matter of seconds. "I watched her go under the freezing water, Trent. I watched her sink into the rapids. I am absolutely sure she did not survive that massive fall." "Obviously, you did not watch closely enough." Trent spat back, his face twisted in a vicious, ugly sneer. "Or maybe you are just completely, totally incompetent at everything except spending money. You told me the job was perfectly done. You told me she was gone forever, and the $3 million was basically sitting in our bank account ready to clear. But now her battered watch is sitting right on my car. Someone knows Chloe. Someone knows exactly what we did up there." "It is the pilot," Chloe shrieked, her voice pitching into an unbearable, hysterical frequency. "He's trying to blackmail us. He wants more money to keep quiet. We have to pay him, Trent. We have to give him whatever he wants right now before he goes to the cops and ruins us." "Pay him with what?" Trent roared, sweeping a heavy crystal fruit bowl entirely off the counter. The bowl shattered into 100 jagged pieces across the expensive hardwood floor, but neither of them even flinched. "I do not have any liquid money, Chloe. The $50,000 I had secretly hidden in my offshore crypto wallet is completely gone. It vanished yesterday afternoon. Some untraceable Russian hackers completely wiped me out. I am completely broke. We are completely broke." Chloe stared at him, her mouth hanging open in absolute horrified shock. The pristine, wealthy reality she firmly thought she controlled was collapsing right in front of her eyes. "What do you mean your secret money is gone?" she demanded, her voice trembling with a potent mixture of terror and rising furious anger. "You explicitly told me we were totally safe. You told me that even if the private equity guys came knocking at the door, you had a massive emergency fund to keep us afloat until the main trust transferred to me." "Well, it is gone," Trent screamed, pulling desperately at his styled hair. And the loan sharks just gave me exactly 48 hours to come up with a massive cash payment. If I do not have hard cash by tomorrow night, they are going to physically break my legs. They are going to take this house. They are going to take the cars. They are going to take absolutely everything we own. You promised me, Chloe shrieked, pointing a manicured, trembling finger directly at his chest. You promised me that if I helped you get rid of that boring, incredibly cheap sister of mine, we would be set for life. I pushed my own flesh and blood out of a moving helicopter for you. I committed a severe federal crime for you. And you are standing here telling me we are broke and about to be murdered. You did it for the exclusive country club memberships and the endless designer shoes. Chloe Trent fired back, a cruel, nasty laugh escaping his lips. Do not act like you did it for some twisted version of love. You hated Rebecca just as much as I did. You called her a broken ATM behind her back. You wanted her dead so you could just keep playing house, pretending to be a rich, high society wife without ever having to listen to her lectures about budgeting ever again. I sat in the dark motel room watching the two people I had sacrificed my entire life for completely tear each other apart. The perfect loving marriage they constantly flaunted on social media was nothing but a fragile glass illusion built entirely on my stolen money. The absolute moment the money disappeared, they turned into vicious, starving animals, willing to rip each other's throats out just to survive. The tension inside the mansion was beautifully suffocating, but I knew it was time to finally deliver the final devastating blow. The psychological warfare had successfully fractured their minds. It was time for the legal and financial execution. I picked up my secure burner phone and quickly dialed Attorney Sterling. He answered on the very first ring, his sharp, experienced voice completely awake and alert, despite the incredibly early hour. Mr. Sterling, I said, keeping my eyes firmly locked on the live video feed of Chloe sobbing uncontrollably in her shattered kitchen. It is time. Pull the trigger on the trust fund. Do it right now. Consider it done, Rebecca, the old ruthless lawyer replied, a deep, grim satisfaction heavily evident in his professional tone. I have already drafted the emergency injunction paperwork. I will file the formal investigative hold directly with the primary banking institution right this second. They will lock down the entire $3 million immediately, pending a formal massive fraud and missing persons review. They will absolutely not be able to withdraw or transfer a single penny of your money. Thank you, Mr. Sterling, I said, hanging up the phone and placing it gently on the bed. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, staring intently at the glowing laptop screen. The exact timing had to be absolutely perfect. I wanted to see the exact moment their entire fraudulent secure universe burned straight to the ground. Inside the mansion, Trent was pacing back and forth across the kitchen, stepping recklessly on the broken crystal glass. We just need to stay calm, he muttered to himself, completely ignoring his hysterical crying wife. The expedited declaration of death petition is already filed with the federal probate court. The judge is absolutely going to approve it in 2 days. We just need to somehow hold off the loan sharks until the morning of the hearing. Once the judge strikes the gavel and signs the paper, the $3 million automatically legally transfers to our joint account. We pay off the violent thugs, we pay off the greedy pilot, and we walk away completely clean and incredibly rich. Chloe nodded weakly, wiping her ruined, tear-streaked makeup with the sleeve of her expensive robe. You are right, she sniffled, trying desperately to regain her shattered composure. We just have to stick to the original plan. Rebecca is dead at the bottom of the river. The money is legally ours. Everything is going to be perfectly fine. Right on cue, a loud, sharp electronic chime echoed clearly through the kitchen speakers. It was the distinct notification sound of Chloe's primary email account syncing to her digital tablet resting on the counter. Chloe wiped her nose and reached slowly for the device, her hand still visibly shaking from the adrenaline. She swiped the glass screen to open the new notification. I watched closely through the high-definition camera as her eyes frantically scanned the text of the urgent email. I watched the final remaining drops of hope completely and utterly drain from her dark soul. Her mouth opened wide in a silent, agonizing scream. Her eyes widened so far they looked like they might physically pop out of her skull in pure terror. The tablet slipped right from her weak fingers, clattering loudly against the granite countertop. What is it? Trent demanded, rushing over to the island with panic in his voice. Who is emailing you at this ridiculous hour? He grabbed the tablet and read the glowing screen himself. I did not need to see the display to know exactly what the terrifying message said. It was an automated, high-priority legal alert from the premier wealth management bank handling my family inheritance. It formally notified Chloe as the secondary beneficiary that the $3 million trust fund had been placed under an indefinite maximum security investigative hold. The bank explicitly cited severe irregularities and pending legal challenges regarding the primary account holder's sudden suspicious disappearance. The funds were completely and totally frozen. No transfers were allowed. No withdrawals were permitted. No exceptions would be granted under any circumstances whatsoever. Docs. Trent dropped the tablet exactly as if it had violently electrocuted him. He stumbled backward, hitting the massive stainless steel refrigerator and sliding slowly down the cold metal to the floor. The oxygen had been entirely sucked out of the room. Their ultimate safety net was permanently gone. The grand prize they had brutally murdered me for was locked securely behind an impenetrable fortress of federal banking regulations and aggressive legal red tape. The loan sharks. Trent whispered, his voice completely devoid of any life or energy, staring blankly ahead. The private equity guys. They are coming for us today, Chloe. They are going to violently take absolutely everything we have, and then they are going to kill me. Chloe received the bank notice and spiraled into a total blind panic, knowing perfectly well that Trent's violent creditors were absolutely closing in. She collapsed completely to her knees right there in the middle of her beautiful designer kitchen, sobbing violently into her hands with absolute soul-crushing, unadulterated despair. The lavish mansion that was supposed to be their royal castle had officially and permanently become their financial tomb. I sat in the freezing cold shadows of the cheap roadside motel and smiled a genuine smile. The filthy rats were trapped deeply in the maze, and the freezing water was rising incredibly fast. The scent of thousands of white Casablanca lilies hung thick and suffocating in the grand ballroom of the Oak Ridge Country Club. It was a smell meant to convey deep mourning, but to me, it reeked of absolute grotesque greed. Chloe had spared absolutely no expense for my memorial service. She had rented the most exclusive venue in Seattle, hired a classical string quartet, and ordered premium catering. I knew for a fact her credit cards were completely maxed out. She was funding this lavish display of fake grief entirely on borrowed money, absolutely certain that my $3 million trust fund was just days away from landing in her bank account. I stood in the humid, bustling catering kitchen, adjusting the itchy synthetic dark brown wig covering my natural blonde hair. I pushed a pair of thick black-framed glasses up my nose and adjusted a black medical mask over the lower half of my face. In the modern hospitality industry, a masked catering server raised absolutely zero suspicion. I wore a stiff black button-down shirt and matching slacks, blending perfectly into the army of invisible staff hired to serve the wealthy morning guests. My fractured ribs throbbed against the tight bindings beneath my uniform, and my splinted right hand was carefully concealed under a crisp white serving towel draped over my arm. I grabbed a large silver tray loaded with crystal flutes of expensive champagne and pushed through the heavy swinging doors into the ballroom. The sight before me was nauseating. Over 200 guests murmured in hushed, respectful tones, holding their expensive drinks. At the very front of the room stood a massive glossy photograph of me smiling naively at a family barbecue from 2 years ago. It was surrounded by an obscene mountain of white roses and orchids. And holding court right beneath my smiling portrait were my murderers. Chloe was dressed in a stunning custom-tailored black silk dress that looked more appropriate for a high-fashion magazine shoot than a funeral. She was actively sobbing into a lace handkerchief, accepting the embraces and condolences of my distant relatives and her wealthy country club friends. Trent stood right beside her, wearing a sharp, dark suit, playing the role of the tragic, steadfast husband. He kept a comforting hand on Chloe's shoulder, nodding solemnly to the guests, offering his profound fake sorrow. I gripped the edge of my silver tray until my knuckles turned white under the towel. The pure adrenaline pumping through my veins tasted like copper. I forced myself to take slow, measured steps, navigating through the crowd. I was a ghost crashing my own funeral. I approached a group of Trent's aggressive real estate partners offering them champagne. They took the glasses without even looking at my face. "This is a damn tragedy," one of them muttered, taking a large gulp of the expensive wine. "Trent is completely broken up about it. They were so close." "Yeah, well, the tragedy might solve his liquidity problem," another man whispered cynically, completely unaware that the dead woman was pouring his drink. "If he gets that trust fund money, he can finally pay off those private equity guys breathing down his neck." I stepped away, letting the tray balance perfectly on my good hand. Every word I overheard confirmed the absolute necessity of my counterattack. They were using my violent death as a financial bailout. I slowly made my way toward the front of the ballroom, navigating the sea of black suits and dark dresses. My target was the reserved family table situated just to the right of the main podium. Trent and Chloe were currently standing a few yards away, speaking to the country club manager. Trent looked flush, sweating slightly under the bright chandelier lights. He took off his heavy suit jacket and casually draped it over the back of his designated chair before turning back to shake hands with a newly arriving guest. This was my window, the opportunity I had meticulously planned for with attorney Sterling. I needed a direct line into Trent's daily conversations to monitor his interactions with his violent creditors. I walked briskly toward the empty family table, pretending to collect discarded cocktail napkins and empty water glasses. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my bruised ribs. If Chloe happened to look over and recognize the shape of my eyes or the particular way I moved, the entire legal trap would instantly collapse. I kept my head down, hiding behind the thick frames of my glasses and the dark synthetic hair. I reached the table, placing my silver tray down with a soft clink. I picked up an empty glass with my good left hand, while my right hand, the one hidden beneath the white towel, reached carefully toward Trent's draped jacket. I had a tiny military-grade audio transmitter no larger than a shirt button pinched tightly between my thumb and index finger. I brushed against the expensive wool fabric, finding the interior breast pocket. With one swift, fluid motion, I dropped the listening device deep inside the dark lining. It slid to the bottom, completely invisible. I grabbed my tray and immediately stepped back, melting seamlessly back into the flow of the catering staff. A deep, profoundly satisfying breath filled my lungs. The wiretap was officially live. I would hear every panicked phone call, every desperate lie, and every piece of criminal evidence Trent generated from this moment forward. But the audio bug was only the first part of my mission. The main event was still to come. I retreated to the perimeter of the room, waiting near the audiovisual equipment table. The string quartet finished their somber piece, and the venue manager stepped up to the microphone, tapping it gently. "Ladies and gentlemen," the manager announced, his voice echoing softly through the large speakers. "If you could please take your seats. The family would like to share a few words in memory of our beloved Rebecca." The guests began moving toward the rows of velvet-lined chairs. Trent walked over to the family table, slipping his bugged jacket back on and guiding Chloe gently toward the front row. The stage was set. I knew Chloe had prepared a written eulogy. I had watched her draft it on her digital tablet through the hacked smart home cameras the night before. It was a disgusting piece of theatrical fiction full of flowery language about how I was her guiding light and her eternal protector. She had printed it out on thick ivory cardstock and placed it inside a black leather presentation folder currently resting right on the wooden podium. As the guests settled, taking their seats and murmuring their final pleasantries, I saw my final opening. The audio technician, a young teenager hired for the day, stepped away from the podium to adjust a loose cable near the speakers. The podium was completely unattended for exactly 10 seconds. I moved with the silent speed of a predator. I walked directly up the side steps of the small stage, carrying a fresh glass of water. To anyone watching, I was simply a thoughtful server providing refreshment for the grieving speaker. I reached the wooden podium and placed the water glass down. I opened the black leather folder. Chloe's beautifully typed eulogy sat right there waiting to be read. I smoothly pulled the ivory paper out and slid it directly under my serving towel. From the pocket of my slacks, I pulled out a perfectly folded identical sheet of ivory cardstock and placed it flat inside the leather folder. It was not a speech. It was a massive bold-printed transcript of the exact text messages Chloe had sent to Trent just days before they pushed me from the sky. She is not even a real sister anymore. She is just the ATM. And honestly, this ATM is broken. Time to make a permanent withdrawal. I closed the leather folder, leaving it exactly as I found it. I picked up my silver tray and walked calmly down the opposite side of the stage, slipping through the side exit doors just as Trent escorted Chloe up to the microphone. I pushed the heavy door open just a crack, standing in the dim hallway, watching the scene unfold through the narrow gap. The anticipation vibrating in my bones was intoxicating. Chloe stood behind the podium, adjusting the microphone down to her height. She looked out at the 200 guests, her eyes wide and artificially glistening with unshed tears. She took a deep, dramatic breath, gripping the sides of the wooden stand. "Thank you all for coming today." Chloe began, her voice trembling with perfectly manufactured sorrow. "We are here to celebrate the life of my big sister, Rebecca. She was more than just a sister to me. She was my entire world." A collective sigh of sympathy rippled through the seated audience. Trent sat in the front row looking at her with an expression of deep, loving support. "Losing her in such a tragic, sudden way has completely shattered my heart." Chloe continued, wiping a fake tear from her cheek. "I wrote down some of my favorite memories of her because I knew I wouldn't have the strength to just speak from the heart today." She reached down with a manicured hand and slowly opened the black leather folder. She looked down, expecting to see her beautiful words about childhood vacations and sisterly love. Through the crack in the door, I watched the exact moment her eyes registered the bold black text. It happened in a fraction of a second. The artificial flush completely drained from Chloe's face, leaving her looking like a wax mannequin. Her mouth opened, but the microphone only picked up a sharp, horrifying gasp. She stared at the paper, her eyes widening in absolute, unadulterated terror. Her hands began to shake so violently the leather folder rattled loudly against the wood. "She's just the ATM. Time to make a permanent withdrawal." The venomous words she had typed in the dark safety of her bedroom were now staring right back at her on the podium of my funeral. She knew exactly what it meant. She knew those words were a private digital secret between her and her husband, and finding them printed here in plain sight meant only one impossible, terrifying thing. Someone knew. Someone was hunting her. Chloe stumbled backward, hitting the microphone stand. A loud, piercing feedback squeal ripped through the ballroom speakers, making the guests cover their ears. "Chloe, what is it?" Trent jumped up from his front row seat, rushing up the small stairs. She couldn't speak. She was hyperventilating, gasping for air, as if the room had suddenly lost all its oxygen. She pointed a trembling, frantic finger at the leather folder, but Trent didn't look at the paper. He reached out and grabbed her shoulders, assuming she was suffering from a massive panic attack, brought on by the overwhelming grief of the day. "I need help," Trent yelled into the crowd, his voice echoing with genuine panic. "She's fainting. Somebody get a doctor." The ballroom erupted into chaos. Relatives rushed the stage. The string quartet scrambled to pack up their expensive instruments. Chloe finally collapsed, her knees giving out completely as she sank into Trent's arms, sobbing hysterically. But she wasn't crying for me. She was crying out of pure, suffocating dread. Her mind was fracturing under the impossible weight of the psychological strike. I stood in the quiet hallway watching the wealthy, elegant crowd descend into total panic. I slowly reached up and pulled the dark synthetic wig off my head, letting my natural blonde hair fall loose over my shoulders. I took off the thick glasses and pulled down the black surgical mask, taking a long, deep breath of the cool air conditioning. The helpless victim they thought they had drowned was gone. The ghost they created was now fully in control of the haunting. I turned my back on the chaotic, screaming ballroom and walked calmly down the long corridor toward the staff exit. I stepped out into the bright Seattle afternoon sunlight, leaving my own funeral behind. I had planted the bug. I had delivered the poison. The rats were officially turning on themselves, and the final legal trap was perfectly set. I sat, completely still, in the suffocating darkness of my cheap roadside motel room. The glowing red numbers of the digital alarm clock read 3 in the afternoon, but the heavy blackout curtains kept the space buried in artificial night. Pressed firmly against my ears was a pair of plastic headphones connected to my burner laptop. The tiny military-grade audio transmitter I had slipped into the lining of Trent's custom-tailored suit jacket during my own fake memorial service was broadcasting with terrifying crystal-clear precision. For the past 2 days, I had listened to the beautiful, fraudulent marriage of my sister and her husband completely disintegrate into a chaotic mess of screaming matches and shattered glass. But today, the domestic disputes had been violently interrupted. The true nightmare they had brought upon themselves had finally arrived to collect. Through the static of the audio feed, I heard the heavy, echoing footsteps of Trent walking across a concrete floor. He was not in his plush, air-conditioned real estate office. The ambient acoustics suggested an abandoned underground parking garage far away from the prying eyes of wealthy suburbanites. Suddenly, the sharp screech of tires echoed through the earpiece, followed by the loud slamming of heavy car doors. Multiple sets of thick rubber boots marched directly toward my terrified brother-in-law. The voices that spoke next did not belong to polite bank managers or gullible private investors. They belonged to the ruthless, violent private equity sharks Trent had foolishly borrowed $3 million from to float his failing business. "You are completely out of time, Thompson," a gravelly, menacing voice boomed through the receiver, carrying a terrifyingly calm authority. "We gave you a generous extension because you promised us that the Dead Sisters Trust Fund was a guaranteed absolute sure thing. But my inside associates at the Wealth Management Bank just informed me that the entire account was frozen under an indefinite investigative hold. We do not like being played, and we certainly do not like being lied to." I heard the sickening, heavy thud of a human body being violently slammed against a concrete pillar. Trent let out a sharp, pathetic gasp for air, his custom suit likely scraping against the filthy wall. Please, just listen to me. I swear to God I have it all under control." Trent begged, his smooth, arrogant charm completely evaporating into a high-pitched, desperate whine. "My probate lawyer is filing an emergency petition with the federal court right this second. The judge is going to declare her legally dead and lift the financial hold immediately. The $3 million automatically transfers to my wife the very second the gavel drops. Just give me a little more time." "You have exactly 48 hours, the menacing voice replied, completely unmoved by the pathetic display of fear. "If we do not have our $3 million cleared in our offshore accounts by Friday evening, we are not going to bother taking your stolen mansion or your leased sports cars. We are going to break both of your kneecaps first. And then we are going to make sure your beautiful young wife pays off the rest of the massive balance in ways she will not enjoy. 48 hours, Thompson. Do not make us hunt you down again." The heavy boots walked away, car doors slammed and tires screeched as the predators left their prey trembling in the dark. I listened intently as Trent scrambled into his Porsche, locking the heavy doors with a frantic, echoing click. He was hyperventilating, his breath catching in his throat, as his trembling fingers dialed his high-priced attorney. "I do not care what kind of legal favors you have to pull." Trent screamed hysterically into his phone, his voice cracking with absolute terror. "You march into that federal judge's chambers right now. You tell him my wife is having a severe suicidal mental breakdown from grief and financial ruin. Tell him the creditors are taking our house tomorrow. We need the declaration of death hearing expedited to tomorrow morning. If I do not get that trust fund released by Friday, we are both dead." I pulled the headphones off, letting them drop onto the faded motel bedspread. The psychological pressure cooker had officially reached its maximum boiling point. Trent was backed into a corner with absolutely no way out, completely blinded by fear and highly prone to making the fatal mistake we had been waiting for. He was rushing blindly into a federal courthouse to commit massive perjury, digging his own grave with a speed and efficiency I could only marvel at. I packed up my encrypted burner laptop and the flash drives containing the digital ruins of Trent's life. I left the dreary, depressing motel behind, stepping out into the damp, grey afternoon air. I caught a yellow taxi heading downtown, watching the towering glass skyscrapers of Seattle blur past the rain-slicked window. I navigated the bustling, crowded sidewalks until I reached the discreet, unassuming brick building that housed Sterling & Associates. When I walked into the quiet, leather-scented office, Attorney Sterling was already waiting for me behind his massive mahogany desk. He looked up from a thick stack of printed legal filings, his sharp blue eyes gleaming with the predatory thrill of a seasoned hunter closing in on his prey. "The emergency petition just crossed the federal docket 10 minutes ago." Sterling announced, a grim, highly satisfied smile spreading across his weathered face. Trent's attorneys practically begged the probate judge for an expedited, immediate hearing. They cited extreme emotional distress, impending catastrophic financial ruin, and declining mental health on the part of your sister. The judge, acting out of misplaced sympathy for a supposedly grieving family, granted the request. The formal hearing to declare you legally dead in absentia is officially set for tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. I sat down slowly in the heavy leather guest chair across from him, placing my encrypted drives squarely on the polished wood. He only has 48 hours before his violent creditors break his legs, I explained, leaning forward to rest my arms on the desk. He is walking right into our trap because his sheer terror has stripped away any rational thought. Sterling nodded approvingly, opening a thick manila folder and spreading the contents across his desk. Then it is time we finalize our ammunition for the ambush. I have meticulously reviewed the hacked financial records you pulled from his hidden servers. The complex trail of shell companies, the forged construction invoices, and the unregulated offshore cryptocurrency wallets prove absolute irrefutable premeditation for interstate wire fraud and severe tax evasion. It is a masterpiece of careless white-collar crime, thoroughly documented by the very arrogant fool who committed it. And the dashcam audio, I asked, feeling a brief cold shiver run down my spine as I remembered the horrifying sound of Trent calmly instructing the pilot to unbuckle my safety harness while hovering over the gorge, cleaned, digitally enhanced, and officially authenticated by an independent private forensic laboratory. Sterling confirmed, picking up a small silver thumb drive and holding it to the light. It clearly and undeniably establishes a direct conspiracy to commit premeditated attempted murder. But the audio alone is not our only weapon today. I have a rather poetic surprise for you, Rebecca. Sterling reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a neatly typed legal subpoena complete with a fresh embossed court seal. When Trent found his smashed Rolex watch sitting on his windshield, he panicked and violently threatened his helicopter pilot over the phone, accusing him of extortion. That was a fatal emotional miscalculation on his part. I raised an eyebrow, genuinely impressed. You actually tracked down the pilot. I did not just track him down. Sterling chuckled, a low rumbling sound of deep professional satisfaction. I had a very private, very stern conversation with him at a seedy private airfield last night. I calmly informed him that my private investigators had already secured his flight logs and that he was currently looking at a life sentence as an accessory to a federal murder plot. But I also offered him a narrow window of salvation. If he cooperates fully, he receives immunity for his testimony. He flipped on Trent immediately. We now possess a sworn, notarized, airtight affidavit from the pilot. It details exactly how Trent paid him $20,000 in untraceable cash to hover dangerously low and execute the violent banking maneuver designed to throw you from the aircraft. A profound, overwhelming sense of relief washed over my tired, aching bones. The snare was absolutely perfect. We had the financial motive, the digital paper trail of fraud, the audio confession of the murder plot, and now the sworn testimony of the hired accomplice. When Chloe and Trent stood before that federal judge tomorrow morning to steal my inheritance, they would be stepping onto a legal landmine that would obliterate their entire existence. Tomorrow morning, Chloe will proudly take the stand, Sterling explained, outlining the final devastating sequence of events. She will raise her right hand, swear a sacred oath to tell the truth, and she will openly lie to a federal judge. The moment the perjury is committed on the public record and the judge prepares to strike the gavel to issue your death certificate, we strike. We do not just file an objection to the petition. We present this undeniable mountain of evidence directly to the court, triggering an immediate avalanche of federal felony arrests. I left Sterling's office with the finalized battle plan burned permanently into my memory. Walking down the busy rain-washed sidewalks of downtown Seattle, the gloomy gray clouds finally parted, allowing a brilliant, warm ray of late afternoon sunlight to cascade over the towering buildings. I stopped walking near a busy intersection and looked at my reflection in the large tinted glass window of an upscale designer department store. For the past grueling month, I had been forced to hide in the damp shadows like a frightened, hunted animal. I had deliberately worn baggy, oversized raincoats, scratchy synthetic dark wigs, and thick, unflattering glasses. I had constantly hunched my shoulders to avoid drawing any attention, keeping my eyes fixed firmly on the pavement to avoid being recognized. I had carried the heavy, suffocating, agonizing weight of my younger sister's ultimate betrayal in every single step I took. But looking at my faint reflection in the polished glass right now, I realized with absolute certainty that I did not want to hide anymore. The physical wounds I had sustained from the brutal river had mostly healed. The agonizing sharp pain in my fractured ribs had slowly subsided into a dull, manageable ache that I could easily ignore. The thick, bulky medical bandages on my right hand had been professionally removed by a discreet doctor, leaving behind a sleek black custom splint that I could easily conceal. My battered body had survived the violent, terrifying fall from the sky, and my mind had survived the complete psychological devastation of learning my family wanted me dead. I pushed the heavy brass-handled glass doors of the luxury boutique open and walked inside, the cool air conditioning washing over me. The impeccably dressed sales associate greeted me with a polite, inquiring smile. I walked straight past the racks of modest, neutral-colored corporate wear that used to define my entire boring, practical wardrobe. I was not looking for a comfortable gray cardigan to blend in or a sensible beige pencil skirt to look invisible. I needed magnificent, impenetrable armor for the federal courtroom. I found it hanging alone on a premium display rack in the center of the store. It was a sharp, impeccably tailored, vibrant crimson suit, crafted from heavy, expensive silk blend fabric. The color was incredibly bold, aggressively bright, and entirely unapologetic. It was the exact kind of outfit that commanded absolute terrified attention the second you walked into a crowded room. It was the exact opposite of a forgotten ghost. I took the heavy garment into the plush dressing room. I stripped off the drab, oversized wool sweater and the cheap, faded motel jeans I had been wearing for weeks. I carefully slipped into the crimson slacks, feeling the smooth fabric against my skin, and buttoned the matching structured blazer. The fit was absolutely flawless, hugging my shoulders with a sharp, terrifying professional authority. I looked up into the brightly lit floor-to-ceiling mirror. The dark purple bruises on my face had faded to a faint yellowish hue that could easily be covered with a light touch of expensive foundation. My natural blonde hair, finally washed free of the cheap brown dye I had used to survive in the logging woods, fell smoothly and elegantly past my shoulders. The woman staring back at me in the mirror was an absolute revelation. She was no longer the exhausted, overly accommodating sibling who willingly worked grueling 60-hour weeks and starved herself just to pay for a sister's lavish country club membership and a brother-in-law's failing business. She was no longer the pathetic, terrified victim hanging by her broken, freezing fingers over a roaring river gorge, begging for mercy from a monster who only saw her as an automatic teller machine. I pulled a bold, dark red lipstick from my purse and swiped it smoothly across my lips, perfectly matching the fierce, relentless energy of the crimson suit. The internal and external transformation was profound, complete, and absolute. The naive, over-sacrificing sister is dead. The cold, calculating auditor is born. I was a financial executioner armed with irrefutable proof, backed by a ruthless attorney and fueled by a righteous, burning fury that could not be extinguished. I paid for the expensive suit in cash, using the untraceable cryptocurrency funds I had successfully siphoned from Trent's secret digital wallet. I walked out of the store holding the heavy garment bag like a highly prized, lethal weapon. The evening air felt incredibly crisp and invigorating against my skin. Let Trent panic and sweat in his dark, stolen mansion while waiting for the loan sharks. Let Chloe practice her fake crocodile tears in her expensive bathroom mirror. They had absolutely no idea that the storm they thought they had permanently escaped was actually waiting for them right inside the heavy oak doors of the courthouse. Tomorrow morning, the ghost would officially return to the world of the living, and the greedy monsters who brutally tried to bury her would finally be dragged straight into the unforgiving light of justice. The air inside the rented sport utility vehicle was thick and heavy, smelling faintly of fresh leather and cold morning rain. I sat alone in the spacious back seat, hidden entirely from the outside world behind the dark privacy tint of the thick glass. Outside the window, the busy streets of downtown Seattle were draped in a gloomy gray mist, casting long, somber shadows across the towering concrete pillars of the federal courthouse. I slowly smoothed the heavy silk fabric of my tailored crimson blazer, feeling the sharp, structured lines of the shoulders. It was a bold, aggressive suit, completely devoid of the quiet submission that used to define my entire wardrobe. For years, I had dressed in muted, neutral colors, trying to blend into the background, taking up as little space as possible so my sister could shine in her expensive designer gowns. But today, I was not trying to blend in. I was preparing to stand out like a massive blazing fire. The dull, throbbing ache in my fractured ribs was still there, a constant physical reminder of the freezing river and the terrifying drop from the sky. But today, that pain did not feel like a weakness. It felt like pure, highly combustible fuel. It was the spark keeping my mind razor sharp. I looked down at my lap where my hands rested. The sleek black medical splint on my right hand blended seamlessly with my dark blouse, concealing the broken bones healing underneath. Just weeks ago, those very same fingers had been brutally crushed beneath the heavy steel-toed boot of the younger sister I had practically raised from childhood. I had spent my entire youth shielding her from every financial and emotional hardship, completely emptying my own bank accounts to keep her comfortable and happy. I had sacrificed my own future, only to have her stomp on my freezing fingers and watch me fall into a deadly, roaring abyss. But sitting in the quiet shadows of the vehicle today, I felt absolutely no sorrow. I was going to push her into an abyss of her own making. The digital dashboard clock on the center console read exactly 8:30 in the morning. There was precisely half an hour remaining until the emergency probate hearing officially commenced. My attorney, Mr. Sterling, sat quietly in the front passenger seat, perfectly still, with a thick, heavy leather briefcase resting squarely on his lap. Inside that locked briefcase was the absolute guaranteed destruction of Trent and Chloe's entire fraudulent existence. The documents packed tightly within those leather walls were sharp enough to cut through any lie they tried to spin today. At exactly 8:45, a sleek black luxury town car pulled up to the curb near the grand marble steps of the courthouse. My breath caught in my throat for a fraction of a second as the rear door swung open. Out stepped Trent, playing the role of the tragic, devastated widower to absolute perfection. He wore a custom-tailored pitch-black designer suit cut perfectly to his broad athletic shoulders. He looked genuinely exhausted, but I knew it was a meticulously crafted exhaustion. I knew the terrifying truth hiding behind his handsome, grieving face. His haggard appearance was not born from the agonizing grief of losing a beloved family member. It was the raw, unadulterated terror of incredibly violent loan sharks breathing heavily down his neck, threatening to physically break his legs if he did not pay them $3 million by tomorrow morning. He reached back into the dark interior of the town car and offered his hand. Then my sister emerged into the gray morning light. Chloe stepped onto the damp pavement, and a wave of pure absolute revulsion washed over me, turning my blood to ice. She was dressed in a stunning, high-fashion black morning dress that hugged her figure flawlessly, complete with a delicate, vintage black lace veil pinned carefully into her blonde hair. She looked exactly like a grieving, glamorous widow from a classic cinema masterpiece. To any casual observer walking by, she was a heartbroken young woman, bravely preparing to bury her only surviving family member. But sitting safely in the hidden shadows of the vehicle, I saw the absolute ugly truth. I saw the heartless monster who had casually texted her husband about me being a broken, automated teller machine that desperately needed to be permanently dismantled. The sheer sickening audacity of their public performance was staggering. As they walked slowly up the massive concrete steps of the federal building, Chloe leaned heavily into Trent's side, burying her face in a pristine white silk handkerchief. Several bystanders, and even a local news reporter waiting near the security entrance, offered them sympathetic, pitying glances, murmuring soft words of condolence. They were banking entirely on that public sympathy. They were relying heavily on the basic human instinct to comfort the grieving and protect the vulnerable. They knew exactly how to manipulate the emotions of the crowd, and they fully intended to use that exact same emotional manipulation on the federal judge waiting for them inside. Inside that towering, imposing building, a seasoned federal probate judge was currently sitting in his chambers, reviewing their aggressively expedited petition. Trent had used the loss of his credit to hire ruthless, expensive lawyers who had painted a highly tragic picture of severe emotional trauma and impending catastrophic financial doom. They claimed my sister was on the absolute verge of a total psychological breakdown from the sudden, unsurvivable helicopter accident over the gorge. They argued passionately that the standard massive waiting period required to declare a missing person legally dead in absentia was a cruel and entirely unnecessary punishment for a young family already drowning in unbearable sorrow. They framed their greed as a desperate plea for closure and peace. The stakes resting on this single morning hearing were astronomically high. If the sympathetic judge looked down from his high wooden bench, today felt a deep pang of compassion for the sobbing blonde woman and struck his heavy wooden gavel, the legal battle would be instantly over. The official death certificate would be signed, sealed, and permanently entered into the federal registry, making my demise a permanent, absolute fact in the eyes of the law. The precise moment that black ink dried the ironclad legal locks securing my $3 million trust fund would immediately spring open, completely bypassing all safety protocols I had carefully put in place years ago. The massive fortune I had saved, managed, and desperately protected from their greedy hands would automatically, legally transfer straight into Chloe's bank account. Trent would instantly wire those stolen funds to his violent private equity creditors, wiping his massive illegal debts completely clean. They would proudly walk out of those heavy oak courtroom doors today as newly minted millionaires, totally free of their financial sins, completely and utterly exonerated of my violent attempted murder. They were fully prepared to live their lavish, carefree high society, lives built entirely on the very money they pushed me out of the sky, for completely unaware that the dead woman was watching them from across the street. I watched them disappear through the spinning, revolving glass doors of the courthouse, completely vanishing into the vast belly of the legal system. The silence inside the sport utility vehicle became suddenly deafening. Mr. Sterling slowly turned around in his leather seat, his sharp, piercing blue eyes locking intensely onto mine. "Are you entirely ready for this, Rebecca?" he asked, his voice a low, rumbling baritone that commanded absolute respect and focus. "Once I walk through those heavy doors and officially file this legal objection, there is absolutely no turning back. You will no longer be a hidden ghost hiding in the shadows of cheap motels. You will be a walking, breathing witness to your own premeditated, attempted murder." I met his intense gaze without a single ounce of hesitation or fear. "I have been completely ready for this day since the exact moment I hit the freezing water at the bottom of the gorge," I replied, my voice perfectly steady, cold and stripped of all former weakness. Mr. Sterling offered a grim, deeply satisfied nod of approval. He reached into his suit jacket and checked his gold pocket watch, the polished metal gleaming faintly in the dim interior light. "The hearing is scheduled to begin at 9 o'clock sharp," he explained, outlining the final crucial steps of our trap. "They will do the preliminary roll call, present the emergency petition to the judge, and allow your sister to take the witness stand to offer her sworn testimony regarding the tragic accident. We need her to speak freely on the public record," Mr. Sterling continued, his voice dropping to a serious, calculated whisper. "We desperately need her to legally commit perjury in front of a federal judge. Attempted murder is incredibly difficult to prove without a body, but lying to a federal judge to steal a massive inheritance is a completely undeniable felony with absolutely mandatory minimum prison sentences. Once she lies under binding oath to steal your money, the federal trap is permanently set. We let her weave her beautiful, tragic lie until she feels completely and totally victorious." Mr. Sterling reached for the heavy door handle of the vehicle. "I am going inside first," he instructed firmly. "I will march directly to the court clerk's office and file an 11th hour objection to the declaration of death. It is a highly irregular and aggressive legal maneuver, but it will force the judge to immediately halt the final ruling and demand to see my corresponding evidence. I will have the recovered dashcam audio, the hacked financial ledgers showing the offshore accounts, and the sworn notarized affidavit from the bribed helicopter pilot sitting right on the defense table ready for presentation. I will text your burner phone the exact moment you need to enter the courtroom," Mr. Sterling said, opening the door and letting the damp Seattle air fill the cabin. "You sit here and wait until you receive my signal. When you finally walk through those heavy wooden doors, you make absolutely sure they see every single inch of the strong, brilliant woman they foolishly tried to destroy." I watched him step out of the heavy vehicle, clutching the secure leather briefcase that held the digital and legal ashes of Trent and Chloe's entirely fraudulent empire. He walked purposefully up the wide courthouse steps with the confident, predatory stride of a veteran prosecutor about to execute a flawless, undeniable conviction. The heavy glass doors slid open and swallowed him whole, leaving me alone in the quiet vehicle to wait. The final minutes ticking down to 9 o'clock were an agonizing stretch of time. The silence in the car pressed heavily against my ears, amplifying the sound of the rain tapping lightly against the tinted glass. I closed my eyes and focused entirely on the steady, rhythmic beating of my own heart. I was no longer the frightened, desperate woman thrashing violently against the freezing currents of the river praying for a miracle. I was no longer the exhausted corporate bookkeeper working grueling double shifts just to pay for my ungrateful sister's lavish country club memberships. That pathetic, over-accommodating version of myself was officially dead and buried at the bottom of the gorge. In her place sat a cold, calculating auditor, wrapped in sharp crimson armor, ready to brutally balance the ultimate ledger. I opened my eyes and stared intensely at the glowing screen of my burner phone resting on the leather seat beside me. Trent and Chloe were currently sitting in a polished federal courtroom, dressed in their expensive fake mourning clothes, completely convinced they had successfully pulled off the perfect crime. They believed they had outsmarted the quiet, boring sister who only knew how to balance a household checkbook. They had absolutely no idea that a massive, inescapable avalanche of justice was currently marching right up to the judge's bench. I took one final deep breath, filling my lungs with cold air, letting the righteous burning fury settle deep into my bones. The trap was perfectly laid, and I was perfectly ready to spring it the exact second my phone lit up. The heavy, polished mahogany doors of the federal probate courtroom stood closed before me like the gates of a fortress. I stood in the quiet marble hallway directly outside. My attorney had gone in ahead of me, leaving the doors open just a tiny crack. It was enough for me to hear the proceedings perfectly. The air conditioning hummed softly against the back of my neck, chilling the sweat that threatened to ruin my makeup. But beneath the tailored heavy silk of my crimson suit, my blood was boiling hotter than a furnace. Inside that solemn room, my younger sister was currently sitting on the witness stand, committing one of the most severe federal felonies imaginable. I pressed my ear closer to the narrow gap, listening to the sickeningly sweet sound of Chloe weaving her masterpiece of deception. The acoustics of the high-ceilinged courtroom amplified her voice, carrying her fake, trembling sobs directly to me. She sounded so incredibly small, so overwhelmingly vulnerable. If I had not lived through the absolute horror of her steel-toed boot crushing my freezing fingers, I would have felt profoundly sorry for the young woman weeping on the public record. I could picture her sitting there under the bright fluorescent lights. She was undoubtedly wearing a tasteful conservative black dress tailored to perfection to emphasize her fragile state. She would have her blonde hair pulled back neatly, keeping her face exposed so the judge could see every single manufactured tear rolling down her pale cheeks. "Please, take your time, Mrs. Thompson," the judge said, his voice rumbling through the speakers with a deep paternal sympathy. "I know this is incredibly difficult for you to recount. Just tell the court what happened when the helicopter encountered the turbulence." Chloe let out a jagged breath, a sound so utterly pathetic and convincing it made my stomach physically churn. "It was supposed to be a beautiful afternoon," she began, her voice cracking flawlessly. "We were taking a scenic tour to celebrate our family. The pilot was navigating through the gorge when a massive gust of wind hit us from nowhere. The entire cabin tilted violently to the right. I was strapped in securely, but Rebecca, her harness, just failed. The buckle snapped open. A loud sniffle echoed through the microphone. I closed my eyes, leaning my forehead against the cool wood of the door. The sheer audacity of her lies was staggering. She was sitting in a federal courtroom, swearing a sacred oath to God and casually replacing a premeditated murder plot with a tragic weather anomaly. She slid across the seat. Chloe continued, her voice dropping to a devastated whisper. I screamed for her. I unbuckled my own harness and threw myself toward the open doorway. I reached out over the freezing water. I grabbed her hand, Your Honor. I held onto my sister with everything I had. I tried so desperately to pull her back inside. The image of her holding my hand filled my mind, but in reality, she had not reached out to save me. She had leaned over the terrifying abyss, looked directly into my panicked eyes, and stomped on my hands with the crushing weight of her heavy hiking boots. "Thanks for the trust fund, sis." Those were the real words she had spoken while I dangled between life and death. But she was so heavy. Chloe sobbed, her voice reaching a crescendo of theatrical agony. The wind was so strong, and my fingers were slipping. She looked up at me and told me to let go so I would not fall out with her. She sacrificed herself to save me. Then her hand slipped right through mine, and she fell into the rapids. I watched the river swallow my big sister. The courtroom was completely silent, save for the sound of Chloe weeping into a tissue. The performance was an absolute triumph. She had painted me as a tragic martyr, and herself as the traumatized survivor, completely absolving Trent of his massive debts and setting herself up to legally steal the $3 million inheritance I had protected for years. "Does the defense have any further questions for the witness?" The judge asked, his tone gentle and accommodating. "No, Your Honor," Trent's high-priced lawyer replied smoothly. "We believe the testimony clearly establishes the tragic and unsurvivable nature of the accident. Given the extreme financial hardship the family is currently enduring, we respectfully request the court grant the expedited declaration of death in absentia immediately." I knew exactly what was happening inside. Trent was sitting at the defense table, dressed in his custom dark suit, pretending to comfort his sobbing wife while silently celebrating his ultimate victory. In a matter of seconds, the judge would agree. He would reach for his heavy wooden gavel and strike the sounding block. That single strike would officially declare me a deceased citizen of the United States. It would wipe out Trent's debts to the violent loan sharks by legally transferring my $3 million into their greedy, bloodstained hands. They were seconds away from getting away with the perfect crime. I stepped back from the door. I smoothed the lapels of my brilliant crimson suit. The fabric felt like a coat of armor. The dull ache in my fractured ribs from the impact of the freezing river was a constant sharp reminder of why I was doing this. The naive, over-sacrificing sibling was dead. The woman standing in the hallway was a cold, calculating instrument of absolute ruin. I raised my left hand and placed it flat against the heavy brass handle of the right door. I placed my splinted, black-wrapped right hand against the left door. I took one final deep breath, filling my lungs with the cool, sterile air of the courthouse. Inside the room, the judge cleared his throat, preparing to deliver his final ruling. Based on the sworn testimony provided today and the lack of any conflicting evidence, I am prepared to grant the petition for an expedited declaration. I shoved the heavy mahogany doors open with every single ounce of strength I possessed. The heavy wood crashed against the marble walls of the corridor with a thunderous, booming sound that echoed like a cannon shot. The absolute silence of the courtroom was instantly violently shattered. I stepped over the threshold and into the brightly lit room. For a fraction of a second, nobody moved. The entire courtroom was frozen in a collective state of absolute shock. The judge paused with his wooden gavel suspended high in the air, his eyes wide behind his reading glasses. The court reporter stopped typing, her hands hovering stiffly over her steno machine. The expensive defense attorneys turned around in their plush leather chairs, their mouths hanging open in utter disbelief. And then there was my family. Trent was standing half out of his chair at the defense table, his face completely drained of color, transforming from a healthy tan to a sickly, deathly gray in the blink of an eye. He looked exactly like a man who had just seen a ghost rise from the very depths of hell. But my eyes were locked entirely on the witness stand. Chloe was sitting there clutching her tear-soaked tissue. Her flawless theatrical performance evaporated into thin air. Her jaw dropped open so wide it looked painful. Her wide, terrified eyes bulged out of her skull, staring directly at me as I began my slow, deliberate walk down the center aisle. My tailored crimson suit burned like a massive blazing fire against the drab brown and gray colors of the courtroom. I did not rush. I walked with a slow, measured, predatory stride. With every step, my high heels struck the polished hardwood floor with a sharp, loud click that sounded like gunshots in the dead silent room. Click, click, click. Every single sound was a countdown to their absolute destruction. As I drew closer, the bright fluorescent lights of the ceiling illuminated my face perfectly. I had not worn heavy foundation today. I wanted them to see the truth. The dark purple and yellow bruises framing my jawline and cheekbones were still faintly visible. The thick black medical splint wrapping my fractured right hand was prominently displayed against my bright red clothing. I was a walking, breathing billboard of their violent failed murder attempt. I reached the low wooden gate that separated the gallery from the trial floor. I pushed it open and stepped directly into the main area, standing right next to my attorney, Mr. Sterling, who offered me a grim, highly satisfied smile. I turned my body to face the judge's bench, looking up at the bewildered man in the black robe. I then slowly turned my head to look directly at Chloe sitting paralyzed on the witness stand. The sheer unadulterated terror radiating from her trembling body was intoxicating. The arrogant, greedy monster who had kicked me out of the sky was completely gone, replaced by a pathetic, terrified little girl who realized her entire fraudulent universe was about to burn to the ground. "You forgot one witness, Your Honor," I announced, my voice ringing out loud, clear and completely devoid of any fear. I stared directly into Chloe's horrified, blood-drained face, completely ignoring the rest of the room. The deceased. The impact of my words hit the room like a physical shockwave. Chloe let out a choked, agonizing gasp. Her eyes rolled back into her head, and her body went completely limp. She collapsed, completely collapsing sideways onto the wooden railing of the witness stand, before sliding into a crumpled, pathetic heap on the floor. The microphone picked up the loud thud of her body hitting the ground, echoing through the speakers, but I did not feel a single ounce of pity. She had just perjured herself in a federal court, and she knew her life was permanently over. At the defense table, Trent completely lost his mind. The realization that I was alive, that the $3 million was locked away forever, and that his violent loan sharks were going to break his legs, sparked a raw, primal panic. He shoved his expensive chair backward so violently it crashed to the floor. He scrambled away from the table, ignoring his shouting lawyers, and made a desperate, pathetic run for the heavy oak doors at the back of the room. He did not make it far. The judge frantically pounded his gavel, shouting for order. Before Trent could even reach the center aisle, two massive federal bailiffs stepped directly into his path. They grabbed him by the shoulders of his custom suit, slamming him hard against the heavy wooden benches. Trent struggled wildly, screaming my name, begging for a chance to explain, but the bailiffs quickly subdued him, pinning his arms behind his back. The courtroom erupted into absolute chaos as the reality of the situation fully set in. I stood perfectly still in my bright crimson armor, watching the two people who had brutally betrayed me face the immediate devastating consequences of their greed. The trap had sprung flawlessly. The federal perjury was committed on the public record. The attempted murder was exposed in the most dramatic, undeniable way possible. I looked down at Chloe sobbing hysterically on the floor of the witness box, and then at Trent being restrained by armed officers. The freezing river had not killed me, and the long, dark nights of hiding in fear were finally over. The boring, quiet accountant they thought they could discard like trash had just balanced the ultimate ledger, and their account was completely bankrupt. The heavy polished oak doors of the federal courtroom had slammed shut behind me with a thunderous finality, but the reverberation still seemed to shake the very foundation of the massive room. The silence that instantly followed my loud declaration was absolute and heavy. I stood at the center aisle in my tailored crimson suit, a vibrant, unapologetic contrast to the endless sea of somber, dark mourning clothes worn by the 200 guests who had gathered to witness my legal erasure. On the elevated wooden witness stand, my younger sister, Chloe, lay crumpled on the floor like a discarded marionette. She had fainted the exact second the reality of my physical survival pierced her greedy, sociopathic mind. Two court bailiffs rushed forward to check her pulse, but my eyes were locked firmly on the polished mahogany defense table. Trent, my charismatic and arrogant brother-in-law, was backed hard against the heavy wooden railing of the gallery. His custom dark designer suit suddenly looked 2 sizes too big for his trembling frame. He had tried to sprint for the side exit the moment I spoke, but an armed federal marshal stood in his path with a firm hand resting on his leather utility belt. Trent stared at me with eyes so wide and bloodshot they looked ready to burst from his skull. His jaw worked frantically up and down, grasping for air, but his smooth, persuasive voice had completely abandoned him, leaving him gasping. He was a rat caught in a steel trap, and he knew it with absolute certainty. The probate judge sitting high above us on the bench slowly lowered his raised wooden gavel. The healthy pink color had drained from his weathered face. He looked down from the sobbing unconscious woman on the stand to the panicked man pinned against the railing, and finally his judicial gaze settled onto me. "Mr. Sterling?" My attorney stepped smoothly to my side. He placed his heavy leather briefcase onto the polished plaintiff table with a loud, satisfying thud that made Trent physically flinch and cower backward. "Your Honor," Mr. Sterling announced, his commanding baritone cutting through the panicked murmurs of the stunned gallery. "I formally present the sole beneficiary of the estate currently in question, Miss Rebecca Hayes. As you can plainly see, my client is very much alive. She did not perish in the tragic accident over the Snoqualmie River Gorge, as the petitioners sitting before you have falsely claimed under federal oath this morning." The judge carefully adjusted his reading glasses, his initial shock hardening into a fierce judicial glare. He leaned forward, gripping the edge of his elevated desk. "Counselor," the judge stated, his voice vibrating with barely contained professional fury. "This court does not appreciate theatrical ambushes. If your client survived a catastrophic aviation incident, why has she been missing for over a month? Why did she allow a federal death petition to proceed to this final stage before making her presence known?" Mr. Sterling did not miss a single beat, holding his ground with unwavering confidence. "Because, Your Honor, my client was not the victim of a tragic aviation accident. She was the targeted victim of a premeditated murder plot engineered by the two petitioners sitting in your courtroom today." Horrified gasps erupted from the crowded gallery. The wealthy friends and distant relatives who had just been weeping for my demise were now staring at Trent and Chloe with absolute horror. The judge slammed his heavy gavel down onto the sounding block, violently demanding immediate order in his courtroom. The crack of the wooden mallet silenced the room instantly, returning it to a breathless quiet. Mr. Sterling unlatched his leather briefcase. He did not pull out simple affidavits or circumstantial theories. He pulled out absolute financial and legal ruin. "Your Honor, my client was forced to remain hidden because her survival was an extreme liability to the petitioners," Mr. Sterling explained, projecting his voice so every person in the room could hear the brutal truth. Trent and Chloe were prepared to hire mercenaries to finish the job if they discovered she had washed ashore. They desperately needed her $3 million trust fund to satisfy massive illegal debts owed to violent private equity lenders. To prove this conspiracy, I submit to the court Exhibit A, a verified forensic accounting of Trent's offshore cryptocurrency wallets and forged construction ledgers, detailing massive interstate wire fraud and tax evasion. Mr. Sterling handed a thick-bound folder to the court clerk, who passed it up to the judge. "But the financial motive is merely the beginning, Your Honor." Mr. Sterling continued, stepping toward the center of the room. "We also possess the concrete proof of the act itself. I submit Exhibit B, a certified sworn affidavit from the pilot of the private helicopter hired by the petitioners. In this notarized document, the pilot confesses under penalty of perjury that Trent paid him $20,000 in untraceable cash to execute a violent banking maneuver directly over the gorge. And finally, Your Honor, I submit Exhibit C." Mr. Sterling pulled a small digital audio recorder from his pocket, holding it high for everyone to see. The actual audio extracted directly from the helicopter's internal dashcam system, which Trent downloaded and foolishly believed he had permanently deleted from his private server. With the court's permission, I ask that this audio be entered into the public record and played immediately. The judge, looking disgusted by the financial documents he was already scanning, gave a sharp, decisive nod of approval. "Proceed, counselor." Mr. Sterling walked over to the court's audio-visual system and plugged the device into the main amplifier. He pressed play without a second of hesitation. The deafening mechanical roar of heavy helicopter blades instantly filled the massive federal courtroom, echoing off the high ceilings. The recorded sound was so incredibly loud and violent, it made several pale-faced people in the front row physically cover their ears in extreme discomfort. And then, Trent's voice echoed perfectly clearly through the surround sound speakers. His recorded tone was absolutely not charismatic or grieving as he had pretended all morning. It was cold, calculating, and laced with pure, unadulterated malice. When I give the signal, you bank hard to the right. I have already filed down the metal locking mechanism on her safety harness. When the cabin tilts, she's going to slide right out the open door. You do not look back, and you do not call it into air traffic control until we are miles away. Understand? The entire courtroom was completely paralyzed by the horrifying audio. The terrifying reality of a man casually and coldly purchasing his devoted sister-in-laws. Violent execution hung in the sterile air like a thick, suffocating blanket of toxic smoke. But the damning audio recording was not finished yet. Chloe's voice chimed in next, perfectly clear and recognizable over the radio static. Are you absolutely sure the trust fund transfers automatically if she is declared legally dead? I do not want to go through a long, annoying probate battle with expensive lawyers. My platinum credit cards are practically maxed out right now. And then came Trent's confident, arrogant reply. It transfers immediately. The declaration of death in absentia petition is already drafted by the lawyers. As soon as she hits the freezing water, we file the paperwork claiming extreme emotional hardship. We will be $3 million richer by the end of the month, babe. Mr. Sterling pressed a button and stopped the recording. The heavy, dead silence that rushed back into the large room was infinitely heavier and far more devastating than before. At the polished mahogany defense table, Trent's team of high-priced lawyers were hastily and frantically packing their expensive leather briefcases. They were seasoned, ruthless defense attorneys who knew exactly when a sinking ship was completely unsalvageable and highly toxic to their own careers. They stepped physically away from their client, refusing to even look at him or offer a single word of legal counsel. Trent was now completely and utterly isolated. The terrifying, crushing reality of mandatory federal prison sentences and violent, unpaid loan sharks crashed down upon his shoulders simultaneously. His arrogant, confident facade shattered into a million irreparable pieces right before my eyes. His basic survival instinct, a dark and incredibly cowardly force, took absolute control of his fractured mind. Trent lunged forward, pointing a desperate, shaking finger directly at his own wife, who had just slowly regained consciousness in the wooden witness box. It was her! Trent screamed, his voice cracking with high-pitched, hysterical terror. Chloe planned the entire thing. She is the one who wanted the trust fund money. She always hated her sister. She called her a broken, automated teller machine. I desperately tried to stop her. I swear to God, I tried to pull Rebecca back into the safe cabin, but Chloe aggressively kicked her freezing hands. She aggressively forced me to bribe the pilot. I was completely manipulated. I am a helpless victim of her psychotic, endless greed. The sheer profound cowardice of his desperate betrayal echoed loudly off the cold marble walls. He was willingly and eagerly throwing the woman he had solemnly sworn to love and protect directly into the fiery pit of federal justice, solely hoping to save his own pathetic skin from the impending slaughter. Chloe, still groggy and deeply disoriented from fainting, clearly heard her husband's vicious, cowardly accusations. She painfully pulled herself up, gripping the solid wooden railing of the witness stand with trembling, pale hands. The flawless, beautiful cosmetic makeup she had painstakingly and deceptively applied that morning was now completely ruined by nervous sweat and angry tears running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. She looked intensely at Trent, the very man she had violently murdered her own flesh and blood for, and she fully realized he was casually tossing her to the hungry wolves without a single second of hesitation or remorse. The absolute profound betrayal instantly snapped whatever fragile, delicate thread of sanity she had left holding her mind together. "You lying, cowardly piece of trash!" Chloe shrieked at the top of her lungs, her voice reaching a demonic, piercing frequency that made the jury box vibrate. "You planned every single detail from the very beginning. You are the one who took a heavy metal file to the safety harness in the dark garage the night before the scenic flight. You desperately needed her dead to immediately pay off those violent thugs who were aggressively threatening to break your legs. You promised me we would be endlessly rich. You promised me we would be perfectly safe if I just kicked her fingers until she fell. You cut the harness, Trent. You planned the entire murder. You promised me." Chloe was loudly sobbing hysterically, screaming her full, unadulterated confession directly into the live, sensitive courtroom microphones. She pointed frantically and wildly at her husband, eagerly confessing to every single dark, twisted detail of their bloody conspiracy in a desperate, deranged attempt to drag him straight down into the deep abyss right alongside her. They were two starving, vicious rats in a rapidly sinking cage, violently tearing each other apart for the last tiny piece of floating debris. They had fully, legally, and completely publicly confessed to premeditated attempted murder, interstate wire fraud conspiracy, and severe federal perjury right in front of a sitting United States federal judge. The federal judge struck his heavy wooden gavel with such intense violent force, I genuinely thought the handle might physically shatter into splinters. "That is absolutely enough," the judge roared, his voice booming with the righteous, furious wrath of the entire federal justice system. "The sheer unparalleled audacity, the absolute grotesque depravity you two individuals have arrogantly brought into my courtroom today is entirely beyond human comprehension. You stand boldly before me under binding federal oath, weeping fake manufactured tears while actively and willingly engaging in a massive dark conspiracy to defraud a major financial institution and brutally execute a loving family member." The judge pointed his heavy wooden gavel directly at the terrified defense table, his eyes blazing with absolute judgment. "I am holding both of you in immediate criminal contempt of court. This fraudulent petition is officially denied with extreme permanent prejudice." Right on perfect cue, the heavy oak double doors at the back of the large courtroom swung open with a loud crash. 6 stern-faced, heavily armed federal agents wearing dark tactical jackets with the bright yellow letters FBI printed boldly across their broad backs marched rapidly down the center aisle in perfect, intimidating synchronization. Attorney Sterling had wisely alerted the Federal Bureau of Investigation regarding the massive interstate wire fraud and perjury trap hours before this morning hearing even began. They absolutely did not come with polite questions or gentle investigative inquiries. They came with heavy cold steel handcuffs. 2 large agents quickly flanked the elevated witness stand, aggressively grabbing Chloe's trembling arms and pulling her roughly to her feet. She shrieked and thrashed wildly, her highly expensive black lace mourning veil completely tearing and falling uselessly to the dirty courtroom floor. "You cannot do this to me," she wailed, her voice echoing with absolute pathetic, endless despair. "I am a victim here. I am the grieving, innocent sister." A female federal agent coldly and methodically read her the Miranda rights, spinning her around forcefully and locking the heavy steel cuffs around her pale wrists with a sharp, highly satisfying click. On the completely opposite side of the expansive room, Trent was absolutely not fighting the inevitable. The violent, brutal reality of his permanent situation had completely and utterly paralyzed his entire body. 2 massive, towering federal agents firmly grabbed him by the broad shoulders of his custom-tailored suit, aggressively spinning him around and slamming him face first onto the polished wooden surface of the defense table. His cheek pressed incredibly hard against the cold, solid wood, his arms wrenched violently and painfully behind his back. The sharp metallic sound of the heavy handcuffs ratcheting tight around his wrists was arguably the most beautiful, perfect symphony I had ever heard in my entire life. Trent turned his head slightly painfully, looking up at me from the flat surface of the table. His dark eyes were completely hollow, entirely devoid of the arrogant, charming, charismatic spark that had defined his entire fraudulent, fake existence. "Rebecca, please," he whispered, a pathetic, miserable, desperate sound that barely reached my ears over the loud courtroom chaos. "I am so deeply sorry. Please help me." I stood perfectly straight and tall in my vibrant crimson armor, looking down at the broken, ruined, pathetic man who had viciously plotted to burn my entire life to the ground. I did not feel a single solitary ounce of pity. I did not feel the lingering warmth of past family loyalty. I only felt the cold, absolute, flawless purity of justice, fully permanently served. "You should have checked the harness, Trent," I said, my voice perfectly steady, clear and devoid of any mercy. The strict FBI agents hauled him roughly to his feet. They forcefully marched him down the long center aisle of the courtroom, parading him directly past the 200 horrified elite guests who now looked at him with pure, unadulterated, profound disgust. Chloe was dragged right behind him, sobbing uncontrollably, her messy blonde head hung in absolute permanent deep shame. The highly cinematic, incredibly satisfying visual of the two evil antagonists losing absolutely everything, their freedom, their stolen wealth, their fake social standing, and their toxic marriage, was burned permanently and beautifully into my memory. They were forcefully marching out of the lavish fake high society world they loved so incredibly much and stepping directly into a cold, dark, concrete federal prison cell. I turned gracefully to Mr. Sterling, who was calmly and professionally packing his leather briefcase. He offered me a small, highly respectful, deep nod. "The legal trap worked flawlessly, Rebecca," he said, his voice a low, satisfied, warm rumble. "The dangerous predators are officially permanently locked in the cage." I smiled a genuine, warm, bright smile that finally completely reached my eyes. The naive, over-sacrificing, boring sister was officially dead. But the incredibly strong, wealthy, completely independent woman who miraculously survived a brutal fall was finally truly ready to start living. 6 months have passed since that explosive morning in the federal courthouse. The swift and brutal machinery of the justice system did not grant my sister or her husband a single ounce of mercy. Trent and Chloe were formally convicted of premeditated attempted murder conspiracy to commit wire fraud and aggravated perjury. The federal judge, a man who absolutely despised white-collar criminals, attempting to casually manipulate his courtroom, handed them both 20-year sentences in a maximum security federal prison. There were no suspended sentences. There were no sympathetic, lenient plea deals. I sat quietly in the back row of the gallery during their final sentencing hearing, wearing a simple tailored navy blue dress, and watched the heavy steel chains of consequence wrap permanently around their wrists. Chloe sobbed hysterically when the judge read her final sentence aloud. She turned around and looked at me, her tear-streaked face silently pleading for the older sister, who used to fix all her mistakes to somehow save her one last time. I just looked back at her with absolute freezing indifference. The naive, over-accommodating girl who would have bled herself dry for her was completely dead. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom closed behind them, shutting them away from the bright, glamorous world they loved so much. Their punishment did not end with a cold prison cell. The violent private equity creditors Trent owed $3 million to completely dismantle their fraudulent stolen empire. The bank immediately foreclosed on their sprawling, custom-built suburban mansion. The sleek luxury sports cars, the expensive designer furniture, the custom wardrobe, and even the elite country club memberships were aggressively seized and liquidated to pay down their massive debts. They were left with absolutely nothing but the cheap orange jumpsuits on their backs and a terrifying, grim future behind cold iron bars. As for me, the storm has completely cleared, leaving behind a brilliant, unclouded sky. My ruthless attorney, Mr. Sterling, did not just help me expose their violent crimes. He meticulously guided me through the complex financial recovery process. I retained full absolute control of my entire $3 million trust fund. The bank immediately lifted the investigative hold the second the federal judge dismissed their fraudulent death petition. But the financial justice did not stop there. Through a highly aggressive asset recovery lawsuit, Mr. Sterling successfully traced and seized the initial $3 million I had foolishly given them to save their failing business. Trent had secretly funneled those funds into hidden, unregulated Cayman Island accounts, planning to use my hard-earned money to fund his eventual escape. The federal authorities froze those offshore accounts and rightfully returned every single penny back to me. Today, my bank balances reflect the undeniable reality of my financial independence. I have a net worth of over $6 million. I left my cramped, dreary apartment and purchased a beautiful sunlit home on a quiet, peaceful lake far away from the toxic noise of the city. I spend my mornings drinking hot coffee on my private wooden deck, listening to the gentle sound of the water, completely free from the suffocating anxiety of managing someone else's fabricated crises. For my entire adult life, I believed my sole purpose was to act as an emotional and financial shield for my family. I worked grueling 60-hour weeks as a corporate bookkeeper, sacrificing my own happiness, my own youth, and my own financial security to keep Chloe comfortable. I let them treat me like a soulless automated teller machine. I allowed them to mock my cheap clothes and my practical lifestyle while I literally funded their lavish, pretentious existence. Never again. The physical scars on my ribs and my hands from the freezing river have fully healed, but they left behind a permanent, powerful armor. I am living a deeply peaceful, financially secure life, entirely on my own terms. I've learned to finally channel my endless capacity for love and care directly back into myself. I am no longer carrying the crushing, ungrateful weight of toxic family members who only valued me for the money I could provide. The profound peace I feel right now is the ultimate victory over the people who tried to bury me. I often think back to that terrifying, deafening moment hanging from the landing skid of the helicopter. I remember the freezing, biting wind. I remember the agonizing, white-hot pain of my own sister crushing my fingers beneath her heavy boot. I remember the absolute soul-crushing heartbreak of realizing that my unconditional love meant absolutely nothing to her compared to a fat bank account. But I do not dwell on those memories with any sadness or lingering grief. I look back on them as the brutal, necessary catalyst for my own beautiful rebirth. Sometimes it takes a violent push into a terrifying abyss to make you realize you possess the incredible strength to survive the fall and climb back up. I survived the freezing, roaring rapids of the Snoqualmie River Gorge so I could finally learn how to truly live for myself. It is a harsh, unforgiving world out there, and sometimes the most dangerous predators are sitting right at your own dinner table, hiding behind familiar smiles and shared childhood memories. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey today. Blood makes you related, but loyalty makes you family. Never let a title like sister or husband blind you to the math of how someone treats you. When someone shows you they are a monster, believe them and then build a trap they cannot escape. Have you ever had a family member completely betray your trust for money? How did you handle it? Let me know your story in the comments below. Do not forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and comment the city or state you are watching from right now. Stay sharp, trust your instincts, and never settle for less than you deserve.